Tell me. Are we going?
And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd. Look at the crowd tonight. Unbelievable. Off the charts. Of course, I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, pretty wild week in general. And I would say, incredible sort of political revelations, ramping up of wars, taking away of rights, freaking out the public with Supreme Court action, trying to get everybody to protest, but not around, key issues and things that you can't talk about, but just the issues they want you to protest on and get upset about. That's very typical America and the world right here in 2022. And tonight we're doing something very special as we're going into the Eighth Sphere Wars, and we'll do it through the figure of Rudolf Steiner, the Austrian mystic and philosopher, scholar. I mean, this is a guy who really possessed many, many different qualities and probably was actually more like five people in one, if you think about it. But I wanted to get Steiner in tonight with the Eighth Sphere Wars. And of course, we've covered Steiner in our Mystery School segments before on the X series. But in this X series episode, which is a special episode 126, this is the Eighth Sphere Wars, Rudolf Steiner's Ahriman warning. And I want us to take it as a warning and to use that, to heed that warning as we move into the period of Ahriman's day. One of the things I think that we can really say without a doubt is the kind of insanity on the political side that we've been seeing is a real reflection of this Ahrimanic tendency in the world right now, and the kind of gobbling up of people's rights and World Economic Forum, Stepford Biden, Harris, that whole thing has a highly Ahrimanic character to it. And I think a lot of the things that we've been seeing on the tech side with Bezos, they were talking about how they have these automated Whole Foods now where there's no actual human employee. They've only opened 2 of those across the country so far.
Where are they?
One's in Texas, which is a weird place to start.
Definitely.
And I think the other one's in California, but they're coming. And the concomitant job loss that goes with that, as well as all the implications of just walking in, getting your stuff and throwing it on this thing and then walking out. Most of the time when you go into a lot of these places now, you see these people running around and you're like, are they employees? But they're not. They're Amazon shoppers, right? So this rollout is sort of already happening because now you have Amazon controlling the groceries that people get and, of course, buying out Whole Foods for that purpose. And, anytime you see centralization like that, it's always bad for us on the freedom side, because the more monopolies these people get, we can see that they really aren't to be trusted with those types of powers. So anywhere that we can support, like with Cash Fridays and things like that, and small businesses and businesses that aren't part of these kind of huge conglomerates, that's really important. And it's very important to have food as a local source. And you're going to see a lot of food episodes coming up here on the X series because food is being used as a major tool and a major ploy. Going forward, we're going to see a whole lot of that. The scary part as they announce all of this is we know from reporting 5 or 6 months ago that Bill Gates bought up the majority of the farmland in America using what? Shell corporations. So we know we're in for it on that, and they're in for it as well because that's how the Russian Revolution started, in fact. So let's keep that in mind. I do also want to put across that the actions, as we go and look at the war of all against all that Steiner warned of, they are really putting us right in the crosshairs of World War III with their actions in Ukraine, and Russia really, in an interesting position there as the invader on one hand, but also, the whole goal of this action. I mean, there's just a fundamental quality of the United States being involved in this effort. And the thing is, Russia is going to beat Ukraine. That's all there is to it. And so they're going to, if we keep supplying them and making money for arms dealers, but also sending them tons of money to pay for the arms. It's like a strange welfare system for the military contractors like Lockheed and Boeing. So this is the nature of a bad situation and a bad setup. Instead, you need a political peace process. And of course, you don't hear anything about that. You know, the idea of a peace process from these people would probably be more bombs anyway. But still, the fact that it's not even, you know, a New York Times headline in the manipulated media is kind of fascinating. It's like they don't even want to think about the possibility of that conflict ending, because part of their plan is to somehow get into a situation with Russia. And this is not the plan of the United States per se, but the forces that are now engaged around the planet for this global dictatorship, and they go right to the heart of our American governance system, which we can get back. But I do want to say that with some of the reports in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times, all that mainstream piece, that in fact the United States was targeting information to Ukraine for how to target Russian generals, was very dangerous, and it makes us a legitimate target in a war situation. So I highly recommend that we put a lot of pressure on that political system to get us out of any entanglement here in the Ukraine situation. And, you know, they're always talking about, hey, global governance and everything else. Well, good. Have the UN go in there with UN peacekeeper troops. All right. And we don't need the United States involved in World War III in Ukraine, which we really, aside from, you know, the kind of World Economic Forum dream of making that the capital of the New World Order, and all of the kind of money sloshing that they've done through Stepford Biden's family there. We don't have any strategic interest in Ukraine, and we are able to put pressure on what's happening in Ukraine, first of all, by not provoking or escalating the effort any further. That would be number one. Two is to initiate a global interest in a peace process there. Everywhere you hear about a peace process, you know, like, oh, the Ugandan peace process. I mean, there's no peace process for this thing. I don't know. They've just forgotten how to do that, or if Stepford Biden just can't remember anything, can't even remember history. Probably not, would be my guess. But in any case, you know, a lot of attention, a lot of pressure on this administration. And the more that we can point out that, you know, we don't want World War III with Russia, because that's what these people, you know, I've even seen the most unusual stories and reports, and I've pointed them out here, which is a kind of a, you know, inevitable nuclear exchange, as if they have a whole kind of group of nuclear weapons that they're just anxious to get funded for or test. And we all know that nuclear weapons are in fact antiquated, and they have something a whole lot better, and have since the late 80s. So this is really a weird exchange. And, you know, unfortunately, there are no good guys. You know, I've heard the reports cycling through the alternative media about Putin is such a good guy, he's just taking care of all the bad guys in there. No, I mean, you know, it's an invasion, all right. And
well, it's a little too simplistic.
Yeah.
Probably.
Oh my God. Absolutely. But that is certainly, you know, a situation where we put NATO on the doorstep, we get this huge reaction. And so the only way to resolve it is to get out of it. And so that's what we don't see out there. And I think that's where the danger comes from. So in terms of the trends around things, war is one that, you know, this group is feeding out there. They want the war activity to keep the fear up. They've had the COVID op. Of course, that's been exhausted and reinvented in a few different ways. And, you know, they still have criminal Fauci out there doing his thing. But nonetheless, like, people have really thrown off a lot of this, and they need to, you know, we're going to see more and more stories, and the dominoes will fall on that, about the lies that were told to get us into that situation. You know, if you read through history, if you read about the Vietnam experience, for example, so many of the things that we're seeing now have happened before, just like the 9/11 lie that got us into Iraq, you know, and Iraq had nothing to do with it. But the CIA was able to convince the ruling powers, hey, let's go in there. But this is what they know best, which is war, division, fear, control. That's where the groups that are in power right now are coming from. And this is where the war of all against all comes into play. And this is something that Steiner mentioned on multiple occasions, saying it was inevitable we were coming into this because this was the goal of what he referred to as these Ahrimanic powers. And of course, we've covered the Ahriman wave and how Ahriman comes through technology and how Ahriman is this dark astral force seeking to possess humanity. And this is something that Steiner made as a real forecast. You know, it was sort of Steiner Nostradamus on that one. But he's been incredibly accurate in relation to the period that we're in. And on the good tip there, he did say that there would be another opportunity for the mystery schools and for anthroposophy in this window of time, 2020 forward, to again introduce this spiritual science. And here we are. And I have to say, you know, I want to say that I see it a lot more. I see people talking about the topic of the eighth sphere, about Ahrimanic powers, about the Steiner work, about Waldorf schools, the whole bit. And a lot of that is in large part due to the ideas from and the conversations that we have ricocheted around in the X series here and in the work of G.G. Young as well, has brought the Steiner work up to a totally different level. So I really credit this conversation that we're all having with this kind of renaissance. And, you know, Steiner talked about it, so it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. As we were studying the prophecy, boom, we reignited all this interest in Steiner's work, and rightfully so. This is not someone who has been widely disseminated generally in America. You know, you do have these anthroposophy centers, you do have Waldorf schools, but you don't really have the full understanding. And I think everybody gains on whatever level, and they don't need to accept every level of his teaching. But it is interesting to me that, you know, I think a lot of people in seeking out Waldorf education or Montessori and things of this nature, you know, are doing it for that purpose of advanced education for their children. I don't think that they know much about Steiner's opinion on, you know, Atlantis or understanding about Ahriman and the eighth sphere. So this is kind of interesting, the culture and the movement that he's brought into play, I think, through anthroposophy with biodynamic farming, eurythmy. There's a number of things that he's inspired. You see the biodynamic wines now, and these are wines without sulfites in them. I mean, quite interesting indeed, the impact, and from many different levels that this very interesting person had. So we're going to get a little into who Steiner was and how he got into that position, because it goes back to that theme, which is so crucial to what we're doing here in this program, which is understanding the impact of the mystery schools and how it applies to this period that we're in and the kind of cycle that's come back around about that mystery knowledge. You know, it won't be probably in the same way, but it'll be in a new form. And I can tell you that I already feel that, especially since the start of the X series work that we've put out there, that there's something crisscrossing in all this timeline about the rebirth of this mystery center tradition, and that we're right in the heart of it. And you know what, from what I hear, people on the ground are really ready for it, because after the major explosions of groups like Theosophy, like the Gurdjieff work and the Casey work, you know, anthroposophy really has come through with that Western tradition intact, along with the Casey work and the Gurdjieff work. But it's interesting because in between, we've seen, you know, the kind of secondary forces come up, you know, the Elizabeth Clare prophets and, you know, the whole Saint Germain movement and things of this nature. And they continue on with the idea, but you get the impression that there's a major input. There's a mystical, you know, spreading of seeds. And then all of a sudden, this entity withdraws after 40, 50 years, it's gone. And then there are all these seeds and all these things happen, and some things come up, but it seems like, you know, they're secondary influences. They're not as powerful as that initial surge of what happened. And then oddly enough, the cycle comes back around again. So I feel like we're coming back into a cycle of firsts. And so first influence And so we're going to be seeing a lot more of that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series episode 126. We are going to go deep tonight on the mystery schools and the Eighth Sphere Wars that were foreseen in the work of Rudolf Steiner through his incredible insight into these harmonic powers that we're seeing so rampant in the 21st century through the control of technology and the complete obeying of scientific materialism and the throttling down of the spiritual impulses. Well, we're here to get it back. And we're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program tonight, so make sure that you can get those in now, actually. And I also want to remind you to go to the darkjournalist.com website before we get started tonight. If you don't have the newsletter, or if you're not signed up for it, go ahead and do that. It's a free newsletter, and it helps us to stay in touch with the incredible, just over-the-top censorship that we've seen. You got censorship, you got surveillance. What else can these people do? This is a centralization machine. But so before we jump in tonight, how are we doing out there?
Doing great. We're going to have some very educated questions tonight. Can I cut to the chase?
That's the idea. So that's pretty obvious.
Chris and Steve Crimmy wants to know, has Ahriman incarnated as Steiner predicted?
Well, he's supposed to, in the early part of the third millennium. That's what we're in. So a lot of people look out at this and say, well, we're in 2022. That's the early part of the third millennium. Did anyone drill down with him? He couldn't reveal the exact date, even if he had it at the time, but he indicated this was the period. So I wonder, when he's talking about this 100-year loop in 1920, about when anthroposophy and spiritual science is supposed to get another shot, because he'd felt, it's very interesting, if you get into Steiner's mentality during the World War I, he doesn't think that it's just a war. He thinks it's a catastrophe for humanity. So certainly war is a catastrophe, but he's gone even further with this. He said the catastrophe part we have to think about, because World War I had spiritual ramifications on the ground, consolidation, and was one of the most brutal wars. They called it the war to end all wars. And they didn't even have the sophisticated things they have now. So they were blindly, very often a whole group of troops would go in and slaughter their own guys because they couldn't see anything that was going on. So, just a terrible period in humanity. And I remember, in the Casey work, and of course Steiner talks about this as well, about this incredible exodus of young souls leaving the earth through these wars. And the spiritual problem of that, but also the confusion in the spiritual, astral, and ethereal worlds based on this. Just really fascinating in that regard. And of course, people like Steiner and Casey redoubling their efforts during those periods to be some kind of a spiritual help in a very real time. I think we get periods of time where we can consider things and things are theoretical and we think, theosophy is an interesting concept. And then there are other times when the thing is just right up, like you are dealing with it and it's right up in your grill. So, when I think about this and I think about the COVID op that they pulled off and the restrictions of freedoms, the incredible crackdown in Canada, Australia, which basically became a prison colony again while they were pulling this out, Jacinda in New Zealand with their smiling fascist routine. I mean, this thing has gone worldwide. So we're right in the heart of it. And the question is, how do we use what the schools have left us in public to navigate our way out of this? And how do we sort of make contact with that tradition? That's another piece tonight. And I'll tell you, it happens rather naturally when it's an interesting thing that I've noticed when you are actually utilizing the information, just like anthroposophy came out of theosophy. Theosophy was a fantastic tradition when it started, but it also came about because the battle that was going on inside of those secret society groups in the 1840s started as a result of this incredible push towards scientific materialism. And this is a core piece where these groups, which normally kept themselves secret, and I'm not just talking about Masonic groups. In fact, a lot of these groups you don't even know the name of because they just are that secret. But those mystery centers, the mystery schools that had kept this information and sort of been a guardian for humanity and been an influence, an impulse towards a better culture, those were very, very powerful groups. There were other groups. And of course, you have the famous warnings by George Washington about the Illuminati. Yeah, that's real. I mean, people go and run over a cliff with the term Illuminati, especially when you get around Hollywood. And there are reasons for that. But you also see this kind of term flying around. But nonetheless, there are real letters with the founding fathers talking about warning, hey, this Bavarian Illuminati is coming over here. All of the major figures in the American Revolution are deeply involved in mystery schools of a lesser or higher degree. And certainly a good deal of them were involved in the Masonic tradition. But again, some people will look at Masonic and look at it a certain way, or blame them for everything, or blame the Jesuits for everything, or blame the Jews, or whoever it happens to be. But that's never going to work. There's never going to be one group that you're going to be able to go to and say, that's the one that's doing it. It is a force working through multiple groups. And we need to keep that in mind. The study of the individual groups, if anything, should, give us some kind of peace of mind about how powerful we've seen on the good side and the good end of these groups and what's happening there. So I think that's what we need to kind of pay attention to, is we're so lucky we have these groups in the background, whether you call them the Great White Brotherhood of the Rosicrucians. There seems to be a dedicated effort to move the culture forward. At the same time, you have the left-hand path schools, and a lot of people identify that kind of thing as Crowleyish, but I'll tell you, there's a much darker wave than Crowleyism. And, but that takes itself to the left-hand side. And it's interesting because Steiner pointed out as well, when it gets to mystery schools, you're dealing with not only right-hand path schools who want to move the culture forward, but left-hand path schools who are dedicated to a kind of a black arts thing. But he also said there was extreme right and extreme left. So, extreme right, in this case, the Great White Brotherhood, which the ultimate font of the ultimate impulse of these higher forces. And that's where the whole Christ tradition on the esoteric mystery side takes root. And then on the extreme left side are these Ahrimanic groups. As a matter of fact, in Steiner's history and his various cosmology about things, the Ahrimanic high priests were the ones who took down Atlantis, and they were the ones who moved in to Mexico and decided we're going to dominate North America. And in fact, there are these groups of brotherhoods that did battle with them for many years in that psychic realm. So many of the things I think that we're seeing are tie-overs from this very period. But let's get some quotes down from Steiner so we start to understand where the terminology around the eighth sphere, the war of all against all, and Ahriman, what is some of the kind of foundation for this? Before I take the jump, Miss Olivia.
I want to go straight into questions. They're so good.
Yeah, go for it.
Robert Harmeling, wouldn't Starlink and Neuralink working together be a type of incarnation for Ahriman?
I think of them more as control elements. In other words, this whole thing, if you get into the really good research, the Nazi approach was, we'll have the best rocket program so we can control things from space. That's where they were going. And they decided to try to gobble up everything too fast. And they took on Russia and they took on the West at the same time, and they crumbled in the middle, but with quite a valiant effort for a relatively small country. And so, as they got more powerful, they got more greedy, and their insanity just went over the top. But the program was about space docks, control from space. That's their program. This is the program we inherited, and I'm sure that the Russians would have loved to have inherited as well. Because of course, I mean, they took their own version of paperclip back with them. They just didn't they got the mid-level guys. We got the top. And unfortunately, with that top group, we got the mentality, and we got the ethic, and the ideology of the group as well. So you got more than you bargained for, and it starts to find itself entrenched. So by the time you get into the 60s, you're really looking at satellite positioning for getting more knowledge and more ability for surveillance and all the rest of it. And we've seen that utilized, in Iraq, for example. They used a lot of space command for that war. And that's GPS on the ground and near Earth, a lower Earth orbit, and things of this nature. So we're already seeing the technology coming in for control from space. That's where they're going. That's why the secret space program is so important, because when you take a look at the fact that we haven't sent anyone to the moon since 1972, that's remarkable. That's really remarkable. We were the top space-faring nation of all. Russia, a close second. And for us to just take 50 years off the program, it's very, very unusual. And we already know that there were weird things about the early moon landings anyway, including the fact of strange money patterns and strange ideas that, some of it was filmed, even if they got up there. So there was already so much secrecy around this thing that we're living in that. So I think when we talk about the incarnation of Ahriman, I do feel that we could be talking about an incarnation through a metal being, a metallic cyborg style being. I don't think it's a normal incarnation. And that's why, we've seen these different things along the lines of CERN and these certain quantum chips that they keep in these cold temperatures that are colder than space. If you think about it, it's pretty incredible. So they're going into that, and they're getting sort of overwhelmed with their own cleverness, which is highly Ahrimanic. So yeah, I think the space control is going to be crucial. And when we get into the eighth sphere tonight, there's going to be a big piece about the space fence in relation to the eighth sphere, because I think that there's maybe two pieces there. But yeah.
I'm understanding this on a whole new level tonight.
Yeah,
this always happens already. Well, it just seems, I love this question about Neuralink and Starlink. It's that what is in our incarnation anyway? And if it's just technology is cold, it's efficient, it's heartless.
Yes, that's our
So in a way, I mean, it is sort of tentacles of the beast, right? You don't even need to say that it's evil. It just is what it is, right?
It's cut off.
It's
from a spiritual
mechanistic,
source.
yes.
Yeah. It's clever and materialistic.
Yeah, it's materialistic. Yeah. So whereas everything that is organic, right? It's artistic, is of the earth. It's, we know what is infused with life and with love. And, and then you think about technology and go, ooh, it's very clear. That's just exactly the opposite.
Infusion is interesting because we're going to talk about the etheric realm tonight. This is a major point in all of Steiner's teaching about the impact that we make and how we have an etheric body, which comes out of the theosophical teaching. And it's interesting because the etheric body, when you get deep into esoteric traditions, if somebody has an illness of a particular sort, then there's a way to work with their etheric body in order to help correct that. And this is interesting, and you're going to take medicine for something serious, but I'm talking about when you get into these situations where working on the etheric body has that feeling in the physical body. It makes that change in the physical body by working with that energy body. That's why I think acupuncture is so effective, in fact. Because it's working with that energy body. When someone goes in for acupuncture, they don't say to you, we're going to work on your energy body. But that's exactly what is taking place. In Steiner's work, he talks about how somebody does something physically on one end of the spectrum, and then they have an active component that is their etheric body. It's a second version of them. in fact. It's the etheric double. And, this gets very interesting when you go into the whole life after death piece as well. And when you get into the idea of astral bodies versus etheric bodies versus physical bodies, because they are, in fact, distinct. So I think that concept, and throwing out that concept in Anthroposophy about the etheric body working as a double with the physical body, it's there, but it's an energy outline of who we are. We've heard about auras. We've seen people who go and can read auras, but there's also, people who developed equipment to take pictures of auras. I don't know. I think in Russia that research continued. Over here it was a fad, and then it went down. Kirlian photography. But this is how I think we get into these types of metaphysical situations, where when you get groups like this and they're like, oh, by the way, you have a totally different body that you're not aware of. And when you look back on mesmerism and magnetism and the way that they cured people using this magnetic healing technique, that's the thing when you go back into the history of it, where we've lost a lot of chapters of development. And mesmerism was one of them, because that crisscrossed with hypnotism and animal magnetism, as he called it. And he was very interested in this at first, in this exchange of this animal magnetism and this fluid that certain people seem to have. But once he learned that he could magnetize, or have someone who was very magnetic magnetize an object and then put that object in a tub of water, and then people could get the healing effect from that, interacting with that body of water, then all of the other research around it got thrown out. And I think in France, they tolerated Mesmer, in fact, in the beginning, and all the stuff he was doing, even though he was attracting all this attention as this really kind of renegade physician. But what happened was he got so popular with people getting healed with this technique that they just ran him out, But there is the echo of the Mesmer stuff by the time you get into Theosophy and Anthroposophy. It's like this thing tried to rise again. It was coming through, and you see aspects of that, and you hear little echoes back there. And so I think Swedenborg is another psychic connecting with this.
Can I share something?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So, I've been processing this for a while about the Grinch. And the Grinch Who Saved Christmas in particular. And I just think there's something really there about the who's in Whoville. And that I think it may come down to that in a way,
Yeah.
if not saying that the Grinch is the embodiment of Ahriman or anything but somehow it seems to me that it's not about him. We can focus on him, but it's actually, we should be focusing our energy on the who's in Whoville, and their spirit is really
is in the
amazing.
Yeah.
If you think about their love and their community and their remembering and embodying that love and celebration and gratitude, that was transformative for a pretty evil character, and that everything came back because of that.
Yeah.
So is it we're going to get to this later, but I love cutting to the chase. Is it within our power? Are we failing ourselves here? Is it up to us? And if so, what do we need to do? Where are we failing? Because I don't think, obviously, everybody keeps looking for some savior character, whether it's Elon Musk or whatever. But this is about us embodying life and love and joy and gratitude and community much more than we're doing. And we keep looking for leaders to inspire us. But in reality, the tools are already there. The books are written. We know what to do. We're just not doing it.
Oh, I think
I'm speaking to myself also.
There's a lot of truth to that. This is interesting too. First of all, I mean, you're always going to find there's a leadership piece with it. And I think that is a great point, which is people project that leadership. But I think even with a situation like that, good things can happen. The problem is in the era that we're in, I think the people on the ground are ready for a lot, but I think the leaders are upside down. And so, with the introduction of Meta from Facebook, which we're going to get into tonight, that's all 8th sphere stuff. And so you have upside down leadership there, corrupt class at the head of Amazon. And, you have them exploiting labor around the world. We've seen that with China and everything else. Unfortunately, some people would say, well, the United States had this chance to make the world great and didn't do it. Now the leadership will move to China. And then you look over at China, and these are some of the most immoral leaders you've ever seen in your life. So no, America still has that ability to be able to do this. But then when you bring it down on a one-to-one level, fundamentally it comes down to the impact that an individual can have, and then an individual with a group and classes. Because what happens generally is, even in a conversation with the ideas from like the one that we're having, and this is the kind of thing that I think these global tech oligarchs really want to prevent, is they don't want the flow of these ideas, because when we get into that type of flow, nobody's as smart as all of us. And so that really gets to your point, which is, when you're thinking about like the whole thing with the Grinch and everything else, it's funny because in the fairy tales are the essence. It's the clue. It's put there and says, you have the ability. Yeah, you have obstacles. You have an insane administration at the helm right now with no popularity and, no ability to actually do anything, but who's running everything through the back door, and so and they get installed in this weird, quasi illegal fashion. And then, it's the same thing in Canada. We have this group that has like a 22% approval coming in and running everything. And what do? Well, they pull the lever for emergency powers as soon as they get into trouble. And I've pointed out many times in this program, the continuity of government is our version of that. That's the lever that they have looked at pulling, because their own popularity for what they're doing is so low. And Stepford Biden is one of the worst presidential administrations I've ever seen. I've asked older people, they've never seen anything like this. This is horrible. So, and that is on the big stage, and kind of really dysfunctional people like Gates and all the rest of it. So we're moved into this era where their intellect and their cleverness has taken them to a certain place, but it has disconnected them from any kind of soul. And I think that's really what the fairy tale is getting at.
We cannot look to those groups of people to save us.
Oh, no.
Well, yeah. I mean, they're, we call them thought leaders and all this stuff. These people,
it would be nice, but it doesn't work that way. They can't even, first of all, even if they wanted to, they couldn't. This is another weird thing, because if, for example, when you say thought leaders, I think of how when Graham Hancock went out and did a TEDx talk, and then what did? They banned it because he was talking about consciousness. I mean, you can't even have thought leaders, never mind if they were so inclined. And, we get guys like Musk and stuff, as somebody pointed out, SpaceLink and Neuralink. I mean, these are not things to move the culture forward. Those are control mechanisms. So yeah, it's nice if the guy says, people at Twitter went too far and I'm going to restore free speech on Twitter. Yeah. Well, I think I pointed out that right after they banned the laptop question, everybody's discovered this. It happened a year and a half ago. And, it's true. I mean, that's such a red line that the whole, the entire culture should have been like, what? You can't ban a story. What are you talking about? You're going to ban newspapers from reporting a story? There wasn't enough, it built. I mean, it took time to build as outrage. But so they knew, they're embarrassed at that leadership level by that group that showed just how fascist they were going to be. And what they try to do is take it out of the news by saying, look, we have this other guy, he's up here, he's going to be for free speech. And all those Republicans and everyone else start high-fiving themselves like, yeah, we're back, But it's really, that is the motion of moving deck chairs around on the Titanic, because, I mean, I'm more in line with the idea that centralization of power just breeds that kind of madness. That's the nature of the problem with it. So we can't have that sort of centralized government, corporate thing running the show. The other thing is that these people aren't advanced enough.
Exactly.
We're not getting advanced. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg, there's no advancement there.
And they get so much. Gigi talks about this all the time. Where are we putting our focus? Our attention is precious. We focus so much on them and we react to them.
Yeah.
And we spend all this time on Twitter being upset and draining our
that's
adrenaline.
Not good. Yeah.
Exactly. And then feeling disempowered and powerless and hopeless, et cetera. And it's a whole cycle, right? And yet we feel compelled to do it. When in actuality, we would probably be much more useful if we took much more time, maybe spent 1 day a week on Twitter, or two, like, just dip
Oh my
in here and
God.
there, and spent the rest of it, a lot of dedicated time meditating, right?
Yeah.
Eating, planting a garden, focusing on doing Qigong, right? Like things for
Hey, listen,
our
I
own.
did Qigong, planted a garden, and, worshipped and read spiritual books. So I did all three today. No, I'm just kidding.
I mean, we haven't
You're
been
right.
able to gather, but that is something that we can be doing.
No, it's true. It's true. And you're right. Look, what happens is it is the 2 Minutes Hate from 1984. We've pointed this out before. And, we have this psychopath who's running this whole board of disinformation for Stepford Biden, Nina, and she is really easy to hate because, first of all, that board is ridiculous, is fascist. Her explanation for it is ridiculous, but she's just some little cog in the wheel. She's somebody who came up through this government thing, was an aide and an advisor to the Ukrainian government. You notice everything circles and centers around Ukraine, no matter where you go.
Mm-hmm.
The Trump impeachment stuff was all Ukraine, the Hunter laptop, Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, phony Zelensky, phony heroes, Zelensky. That's all Ahrimanic. It is the creation of an image, and it's actually the image of the opposite, which is this guy's not a hero at all. He's a paid-off comedian who's doing a job. And this is where we can free ourselves, and it starts mentally. So I'm glad you mentioned that about Twitter, because I believe it's built in to those systems, just like they found out about Candy Crush years ago, that there were things in Candy Crush that were sucking people in to do it. And I think that Twitter is the same way. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. I have to tell you, we're in, Gurdjieff called it the terror of the situation. And Steiner saw opportunities, but he saw this big clash with this eighth sphere period, and the ability of that technology to lead us into this virtual reality. And when you get trapped in there, somebody else is calling the shots and draining you. So we're going to see if we can pull some of that drain away tonight by going back and seeing what he had projected out into the distance with his spiritual science all the way back there in 1920. We will take more of your questions in the second half of the program. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read a little bit about Steiner. And it's funny because you mentioned Gigi, and it's great. I hope Gigi's still out there, because she had let me know that there was a group on Facebook that had run across some negatives of Steiner and had really processed them with modern photography equipment. So I went up there and grabbed some of them for you tonight. But that, of course, is Rudolf Steiner when he was the leader of the Theosophical branch in Germany for Annie Besant. And Annie Besant took over after Blavatsky died, and Blavatsky handpicked her. She was a remarkable figure in her own right and had led a lot of protests for the terrible conditions that girls had to work in London in the late 1900s, and also for Irish home rule, and most importantly, I guess, for India's home rule. And she became the great inspiration for Gandhi and gave him the name Mahatma Gandhi, and inspired his entire fight for, getting back to the sovereignty for the Indian people, but without a big war to do it. And so he did it through nonviolent means. It wasn't easy. And as he pointed out, even in a regular war, you're going to lose some, win some, lose some. But that was the great inspiration for Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in America. So we see the principle comes directly out of that esoteric lineage. Steiner went on and became sort of a favorite of the Theosophical Society. And then that's another one of those shots. And it gives you, I think, an idea of Steiner. Very often, I think a lot of the different portraits of him, this is him just sort of casual. And what happens basically is Theosophy gets under the influence of groups that have political aims, spiritual aims that are not in line with the original founding of it. As Steiner would say about Theosophy, that true initiators stood at its cradle. So this is important because it's good to know that Steiner, when he rejects Theosophy, understands the impact that it had. He's just saying, I need to take this in a different direction. So Anthroposophy is his Western mystery school piece that, that's the movement directly out of what had spawned as Theosophy, but really was unraveling into, hey, we've got our own world teacher. He's this Hindu child, and we're going to have a Hindu world teacher God through him. And suddenly there were all these kind of little offshoots and problems with Theosophy, where one person was like, I got a message from the Ascended Masters, and it seems like after that direct link of Blavatsky interacting with those mystery schools, that you have a lot of infighting, and there's a lot of spin-offs, and some people think that the spin-offs have merit. I've never been able to get into the work of Bailey or that whole succession. But I see that there's a thread that comes out of Theosophy that gives us Anthroposophy. And so, Theosophy is incredibly important. So what happens, basically, 1875, the Theosophical Society is founded. And it's founded by Blavatsky. I want to say a few things about Blavatsky, because she's often vilified, and there are all these things that are said about her, like, oh, Blavatsky is a Satanist and all this stuff. It's just not true. As a matter of fact, her whole goal was there is no religion above truth. She had seen religions kind of using their followers. And how many times in our own lives have we seen that, even if we understand the incredible value and power of a spiritual belief? We've seen it abused in different scenarios. And certainly in the public, we've seen it with the Catholic Church and, Baptist Church, and, through all types of different types of religious beliefs, all of those things about the Eastern guru, and what he's really doing is getting all this money and sex from his followers, So we've seen, when you put people in those positions, that unless they're really inspired, you're not going to get good results. So what happened, I think, with Blavatsky is that she really was herself. She didn't care so much about the PR, and people found her very off-putting because she had a very short temper, and she was very to the point, and she was Russian and a woman in 1875 in America. That couldn't have been easy. But she had that incredible atavistic mediumship, and she could enter into those spiritual realms and bring forward those truths. And when you look at the book Isis Unveiled, and you think, this book is from 1877, there was nothing in the world that had been revealed like that. And what Steiner says about it is that the mystery schools themselves were like, what? We didn't know she was going to reveal that much. And her presence had come about. It had been predicted by a number of different secret societies and mystery schools. They knew astrologically that somebody was coming in who had this ability. And she was incredibly rare in the sense that she had the ability that we had lost in humanity. And we hadn't had it for something like 2,000 years, where she could enter into that spirit realm, see what was happening, and bring it back. That used to be a natural talent for certain types of humanity. And it just went away the more industrialized we became. So certainly her presence was understood, and they wondered, well, with her strange temperament, is she going to be able to do this? And so her own life story is quite remarkable. And I feel that when we understand her contribution properly, then, that kind of caricature of her as just, some fortune teller or rip-off artist or a Satanist or something like that just goes away. Because, she's not perfect, but she brought forward Theosophy because she was kind of a master in her own right. There's an interesting quote in a really remarkable book that Steiner wrote called Spiritualism, Madame Blavatsky and Theosophy, where he really is very honest about her, but gives her a lot of credit. But I like this quote because it gives us that idea that even when you're traveling on that very high level, you're going to have those human qualities and those human, inclinations that are going to ruffle people in the wrong way. And so Steiner says, let's consider what was said by one of H.P. Blavatsky's friends who had deep insight into her character. He said that Madame Blavatsky was really a threefold phenomenon. Firstly, she was a dumpy, plain woman with a magical mind and a passionate nature, always losing her temper. To be sure, she was good-natured, affectionate, and compassionate, but she was certainly not what one calls a gifted woman. Secondly, when the great truths became articulated through her, she was the pupil of the great masters. Then her facial expression and her gestures changed. She became a different person, and the spiritual worlds spoke through her. Finally, there was a third awe-inspiring, supreme, regal figure. This occurred in the rare moments when the masters themselves spoke through her. Lovers of truth will always carefully distinguish in Madame Blavatsky's work what is essential and what is not. No greater service could be rendered to the one who is in our thoughts today than to look at her in the light of truth. No greater service could be done to her than to lead the theosophical movement in the light of truth. So she was the great instrument for this unfolding. And, you know, theosophy became controversial, but when you think about the things that it introduced, really the Eastern concepts, meditation, yoga, even cremation, I mean, it's remarkable the impact that it had on America and on spiritual thought. And, you know, really the things that she was revealing in that period could very easily, you know, a couple of centuries earlier, they would have burned her at the stake for it. So, you know, we can really see the movement of culture there. So it's a very unusual period. You have Bulwer Lytton's material has been out, and that is talking about vril and underground societies. You've got the Theosophical Society. You have all this craze for spiritualism, mediumistic craze. And it is, in fact, Emma Britton, who was a product of the Orphic Circle, which was a group of literary people and political people. And she had worked with them as a teen. And she, you know, was an actress and an opera singer and all the rest. And her story is quite remarkable. But what's not often talked about with Emma Britton is that she's the other real pole in the Theosophical Society. It's her and Blavatsky who set up the Theosophical Society. Blavatsky sets it up in New York with Colonel Olcott, and in turn, they have her set up the other part of it in Boston, not far away from here, in fact. So it's interesting to me that you know, we have very spiritual, psychic people at the foundation of theosophy, and I also see there is that guiding force. You get really about 30 years later, and Steiner's involved. So, you know, Blavatsky has died. He never met her. He meets Besant, and of course, he becomes kind of her second in command for Germany. And at a certain level, he says, I can't really get with this, and I have to. It was kind of heartbreaking for him to do his own thing. And it's interesting. I've been trying to find, and I've spoken to a lot of different Steiner people about images of him doing oratory. This is the only one I found, and this is his initial group that he's speaking to there when he has taken flight from Theosophy. And it's a very small group that he's working with. He's taken his own German chapter and saying, I'm going to do Anthroposophy. Those of you who want to follow along, you're free to come on the ride. And there's a description by a student of this period that when they were doing these meetings, you know, it's so great that we in the Ideas Room get to do this, because when they were doing those meetings, they would meet in a pub, and there was a small stage on the pub. And then in the particular place where Anthroposophy got started, there was a big hole, like a construction hole in the floor. So everyone very carefully, almost symbolically, had to walk around this pit and sit, you know, in front and just kind of make sure that you had your wits about you. But Steiner, at that point, you know, was dealing with a very small group, maybe 30, 40 people. And it exploded because even though he was a very popular teacher in Germany, the Theosophy was like, oh, you know, like, he's out. We're not dealing with him. And so a lot of interesting things were happening in this period, but Anthroposophy becomes a power unto itself because Steiner had a great discipline about him. And he didn't live in a very extravagant manner. And as a matter of fact, some of the descriptions of that period are him living in something like a rooming house and publishing a monthly magazine newsletter all about gnosis and, getting into these things. And he's working at the university part-time and all the rest. So somewhere in that period, he had written a couple of books that were already getting out there. And by the time he writes Knowledge of Higher Worlds, that's kind of, I guess you could say, his hit single. That's the one that really puts him on the map. And Knowledge of Higher Worlds and its attainment is basically a manual for how to, kind of in that period of time, let's say 1910-ish, take all these different things that were available and use them. So he had exercises in there, he had spiritual concepts and all the rest. So that is sort of the introduction to core theosophy. He had already, he'd written some powerful books about Goethe, and he'd had involvement around Nietzsche and got to meet Nietzsche when Nietzsche was insane. And, everyone was against Nietzsche, and he wrote something in defense of Friedrich Nietzsche. So he'd gotten out there. He was starting to become a person in demand. And his own work was already surpassing the interest level that theosophy was currently at, because theosophy was faltering at that point, even though it was a large organization. Really, after the impact of Madame Blavatsky, the books and things of that nature were just more like kind of their group liked them, but I think in terms of things like Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine, which were Blavatsky books, those were books that were bestsellers in that period. And they're just mind blowers, how people back then were reading this information. So we can see there's a mystery track in here. Somewhere along the line, Steiner has an experience. And this goes back to when he was younger and a student in Vienna. When he, on his way back and forth, he would meet this gardener named Felix. And Felix was unusual. He was like a strange, unusual psychic who was a gardener. And he was totally illiterate in terms of education, but he had these other quite remarkable talents. And what he found out from, Felix and his interactions with him was that Felix was connected with a Rosicrucian school. They don't actually identify it as Rosicrucian. However, if you read enough between the lines, it's a Rosicrucian school. And a master from that school comes forward and tells Steiner all those weird experiences you had, like, seeing deceased relatives when you were growing up and seeing lines in the sky and connections in the universe and things. That's all because you're meant to be doing this work. And so this master kind of gives him this task of bringing in the spiritual science. And what's fascinating is he's already a very accomplished student. He's a very advanced student. Early on, he was not a good student. He was a poor student. And what happens is he discovered geometry. And somehow geometry opened everything else to him from being of kind of an unusual shut-in in these classes. But that experience with the master is kind of like Blavatsky, who has a similar type of thing happen. So we have then the shifting of his life and going into this career of writing and lecturing, working with Theosophy, and then finally parting from them to become the head of Anthroposophy. So we get Anthroposophy 1912. 1914, you've got World War I. And that is the catastrophe that Anthroposophy and Theosophy sought to stop. So Steiner gets into overdrive. He's like, you know what? The worse the situation gets, the more I'm going to do. And he starts to take some of his secret lectures, like lectures about Ahriman and the Eighth Sphere and things like that. And he says, you know what? Things are so beyond the beyond. I'm not just going to keep that for a very small group of students. That's going out to everybody. So it starts to catch on around that this guy is doing lectures. He has books about these very unusual concepts. And he's really kind of establishing a name for himself. And it's going to make him a target for rising groups out there like the Nazi Party, for example, who will repay his investigations into the spiritual realm with destroying the Goetheanum building that he develops to house Anthroposophy. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep tonight through the figure of Rudolf Steiner into the Eighth Sphere Wars. We're going to be taking your questions in part 2. Olivia's already laid out a couple. How's it going out there?
Good. Bill Ferry wanted you to comment on Britain's declamation of reincarnation.
Well, there's a lot of different pieces when we get to reincarnation, especially, what that reminds me of is when reincarnation gets introduced by Allan Kardec. And that's early. That's actually pre-Theosophy. That's 1862, 1864. And when we get to Blavatsky, in Isis Unveiled, there isn't any mention of reincarnation. It's not the emphasis of it. It's the next book, Secret Doctrine, that picks up that whole trail. And that's huge because Theosophy introduces the reincarnation piece. Anthroposophy has it. The Gurdjieff work has it. Anything that is of an esoteric nature publicly from that point forward, reincarnation becomes a major piece of it. And really, in America, reincarnation gets picked up dramatically. But there's a lot of resistance to it. And interestingly enough, in C.G. Harrison's work, which in that period is a very unusual figure who comes out and gives these lectures about the mystery school wars that are going on. This is about 1893. And he's trying to put the reincarnation thing back, the genie back in the bottle, because there are certain groups among those mystery groups who are like, it's okay that we let out certain things, but the reincarnation thing is too much to swallow. So how reincarnation gets introduced on the esoteric level and how it's dealt with, I think is fascinating in and of itself. Yes, what do you got?
I'm going to go for it. John Howard says, our rulers are literally demon infested. Would Steiner have any advice to us about how to exorcise those demons?
It's really interesting. I mean, he was around some of the worst teachers, leaders in that period as well, and that the rise of Hitler is not far away. And Hitler actually has an editorial that he writes about how evil Steiner's work is. This is interesting when you think about it, because they just didn't like the competition esoterically, because they certainly were deep, well steeped in theosophy themselves. But he talks a lot about the leaders that came up, and he also was aware that leaders in England in the 19th century, like Disraeli and others, were all part of this Orphic circle. So he knows that the mystery schools and the secret societies are putting these people out there. And he's very aware of which schools are controlling it. At one point, he says, in relation to the American political problem, 1915, that the American political leadership is intertwined with in deep secret mystery school societies. They are, in fact, brothers in those societies who are setting up this leader, that president, this prime minister, and so forth. I'm going to tell you an interesting thing. There's so much agreement among the Casey work and the Steiner work in relation to so many different things, including the reincarnation of John the Baptist as Raphael, Renaissance painter. But what's interesting is there's a distinct dispute between the information of Steiner and the information of Casey when it comes to Woodrow Wilson. Now, Wilson sought out Casey, and Casey actually gave him readings, laying out the famous 14 points and all the rest. And he was also called in to give healing readings for Wilson's deteriorating health condition during World War I. But he talked about how during the Treaty of Versailles and the setup for all that, and the development of the League of Nations and the family of nations idea, that he said that the Christ himself sat at the table through the figure of Woodrow Wilson, where Steiner had a very low opinion of Wilson. So it's interesting to figure out how these people look at things differently. I also seem to recall there's a Casey reading on Cosmic Memory, which is Steiner's book about Atlantis. And it's fascinating because someone says, is Rudolf Steiner's work, Cosmic Memory, correct? Is this how do you feel about this material? And Casey said, well, it's correct on a trend. There's no question about it. It is the visioning of the Akasha Chronicle by an individual and him working through those things. So it's, even if you don't think it's entirely accurate, it's correct on a trend. So this is interesting, Casey looking out spiritually at the work that Steiner is doing spiritually and weighing it out. He did, in fact, recommend Steiner's work on another occasion, as well as Blavatsky's work. So there is a lot of simpatico there. But it is interesting that there's this kind of like, take it through the level of the lens that the person is looking through it. And I think this is something that circulates in mystery terms as well. And that the Akasha Chronicle, I think, is important for us to talk about for a moment too, because this idea that if you get to a certain level in the mystery schools, or you have the ability, you can read that Akasha Chronicle. And the Akasha Chronicle being the Akashic record of everything that has ever happened anywhere, that you can basically tune into it and watch it like a movie. This is very fascinating, comes right out of the mystery schools. And we have to wonder what they're trying to tell us with this, that there's some kind of recording mechanism for this. At a certain point in the Casey work, he actually talks about how a device could be created to read that. In other words, hey, I'm going to plug in, what is that Star Trek episode about the huge time machine? And he's viewing different chapters. It is City on the Edge of Forever.
Yes, of course.
Unbelievable. And it's interesting because it's very much like that. So it is a chronicle of everything that's ever happened. So when Steiner is going in and looking at Atlantis and seeing what took place there and the disaster that took place and how that set us up for a reincarnation cycle of all this happening all over again, where we get an opportunity to do something different with it, he's reading the Akasha Chronicle, and he is, getting that information and that inspiration from watching those things and then interpreting this totally unusual period and working with it spiritually. One of the interesting things that people close to Steiner during the end of his life had said was that he spends so much time in the spiritual world that the physical body, because of the energy of his spiritual body going into that spiritual world and researching, is suffering. And that's, part of the difficulty that he had in later years. I think I've pointed out on this program before that Steiner was in fact poisoned at the end of his life. So we don't, yes.
Well, Griffin Eagle 7 wanted to know, who do you think poisoned Steiner?
Well, I did some research on it. This is a period where Steiner has kind of got control of anthroposophy back, because he sort of loses it to a certain degree. And he's working with some people who are associated with a group called the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor. And they instantly want to initiate him as the head of this branch while he's doing spiritual science. And he, at first, is trying to work with them. And then he says, you know what? It's not going to work this way. That, like, humanity is not going to work as a mystery tradition from behind the scenes. It has to be out there. We've already seen this with World War I. We're going to make it public. We're going to keep going on that trend. So that ends the association with these other esoteric triangles. But I think what happens is when Steiner gets targeted in that period of his life, because he's making so many fast changes and he's growing anthroposophy at a terrific rate. And what happens is, when he is poisoned, when he dies some 2 weeks later, and he's actually put a lot of material together while he's dying. So 2 or 3 weeks later, he passes away from this incident. And there are celebrations in the American Black lodges, so the occult schools that were really against Steiner. and that's kind of interesting to me because it gives you some idea of the origin of it. For some reason, I think the import of Steiner's work over here was highly opposed by other groups over there. And that's where I think the rub was. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of dark occult schools in France and Germany and Switzerland and all the rest that could have been responsible. But interestingly enough, we have those celebrations. It's interesting, too, because he was aware of it. He was actually at an event, and it was in his tea that he was poisoned. And he goes to an aide, a young anthroposophist, and says, listen closely to me. I've been poisoned. I want you to take me out of this event and, bring me to medical attention, and don't say anything about it. Because I think that he understood he didn't want to be the leader, the spiritual leader who had been taken out by somebody poisoning him. He didn't want this sort of legend to be hanging out back there. But I think now, 100 years later, the story can be well understood that Steiner, when he dies in early 1925, it's the result of this poisoning. And I don't know how much longer he would have lived, but there was a plan there to remove him. I also think that Steiner was a threat because he had released the Ahriman 8th sphere information, which I think becomes so crucial to the period that we're in. And if you think about that period that he's in, it's just before World War II. He's gone through World War I. He's about to make a real heavy impact in Germany. And the Nazis target him early on. Remember the beer hall putsch and Hitler's attempt to grab power in Bavaria? That's 1923. So when they burn down the Goetheanum, that's 24. It's the next year. They don't want the competition. And the Goetheanum took a decade to develop. And I have, they rebuilt it, certainly. The original was quite unusual, though. There's the one they rebuilt, and that's the one that's in Dornach, Switzerland now. So that they were able to reconstitute it. The original was very unusual, and I've shown it here before. I think I might have it here somewhere. Oh, there it is. Well, that's him with the model of it, but it is really an unusual. It looks like some kind of a building from like the planet Jupiter or something. And you see that? That's the model.
Fantastic.
And what Steiner was trying to do is create those spiritual centers, and he was working very hardcore at this time with spiritual architecture and really, going in that way. And that's where we get the incredible sculpture that he did of Ahriman. I want to say that Steiner, when he talks about this, he talks about how whenever he tuned in to Ahriman, he felt a heaviness. And some of the things and some of the quotes I'm going to bring forward tonight talk about how Ahriman is right under the surface of the earth. And so I think that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that so much. But there's a period where Ahriman invests himself and sort of attaches himself to the evolution of the earth. It's an unnatural attachment. And Ahriman being that Persian name for the devil in the Ahura Mazda mythology, Zoroastrianism, and Ahura Mazda, his twin, being the kind of hero Christ character. It's very interesting that they're trying to give in that mythology the real answers around this. Why Steiner chose to use the Persian names for this is interesting, but he always separated Lucifer from Ahriman, even though both are known as the devil. He saw it a little bit differently. He saw the Lucifer is a gnosis, like a knowledge base, which can be used for good or evil. And so the nature of those beings was different than the Ahrimanic beings, which had a directly evil impact and were all about capturing and trapping souls on Earth through this mechanism of the eighth sphere. This is what we're going to get to. But this is that sculpture that he did of Ahriman. I've shown it on the program before, and I always get the most interesting emails about people and their different stories about, I've seen that face before, or when I saw it, I had this reaction to it. And I do feel that Steiner is trying to say, look, this isn't something we want to run from. And he's very clear about that. He's like, you don't run from Ahriman. What you do is you face it, and for humanity's sake, you obtain from Ahriman what Christ needs. It's very interesting. Now, I think that, the Christ part, when you get into anthroposophy and the esoteric Christianity, we have to understand it a little bit differently. But basically, it is that same Christian influence. It's the Christian story, and it is Christ, the figure. And that is the heart of the mystery school teaching as well. This is the interesting thing between the church, which keeps the mystery side secret, and the public kind of, thing that we've had. And it's tricky on the religion side, because sometimes you get great churches and great things, and then you have a whole tradition of hellfire burning and all this kind of thing. So you can see the abuses around religion, and then you can see the real promise of the whole thing. When you get to esoteric Christianity, what it's telling you is there's a long tradition of Christ associated with the deeper ideas and the whole thing around reincarnation and all the esoteric concepts. They have Christ right in the middle of it. So it's kind of a accepted or rejected kind of thing. But in any case, Ahriman, when he tuned into the figure of Ahriman, Steiner got this heavy feeling and talked about feeling like he was in concrete, and would later describe the idea that Ahriman wants to turn the world into a gigantic deep freeze. And doesn't that make you think nuclear? It really does. I could tell you that from my own studying of Steiner, which goes on for a long, long time, even when I was very, very young, I can tell you that I think the majority of his public life was spent trying to warn us about Ahriman and the Ahriman influence. The Ahriman description of the goal of the technology and the scientific materialism subsuming the spiritual push, and severing the knowledge of the spiritual awareness from the human being is core, because without it in the Steiner work, it's almost like it doesn't matter the different things that you would learn, because if Ahriman shows up and you're unawares, all of that knowledge goes down the drain, because the cleverness of the Ahrimanic technique, the Ahrimanic forces, is that they are always working to outsmart humanity and to have them participate in their version of evolution. And that is the kind of master-slave relationship that we've seen so much in the world, and which we see so active even now. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We are going deep here on the Eighth Sphere Wars and the Ahriman mystery. We're going to be taking your questions in part 2 of the program. We've taken a couple of really good ones. Of course, you and the Ideas Room are giving your best, as usual. Before I jump into these quotes, Miss Olivia.
Anders has this really great question. I got the impression that Steiner described Lucifer as spiritual bypassing and Ahriman as materialistic bypassing, if that's a term.
Well,
Cheating.
there's some truth to both of those, because the Ahrimanic force is to identify everything with materialism and to concretize everything. So if I get you thinking in numbers about everything, if you imagine, you have this incredibly powerful spiritual experience, then, it's a feeling, right? And so this is something that's very deep in a person, and the feeling grows. If it's just an intellectual acknowledgement that something has taken place, you'll be like, on this date, this happened, I was this old, etc. So that's more of a kind of an Ahrimanic way of doing it. You're not feeling it anymore. It's just a kind of a notation in a book somewhere. This idea for me is that you can separate, because remember, there are aspects of the Ahrimanic approach which are necessary for us to apprehend, because they do have this incredible knowledge, incredible awareness, and incredible cleverness. And that is something that we are supposed to learn from that battle that we have with the Ahrimanic forces. What do you got?
This is a great question. God's Truth War. Curious if Ahriman is or is related to Gigi Young's cosmic AI referenced in the Mad Scientists of Atlantis video, the AI the Martians channeled, the Atlantean Black Magicians.
Well, you're going to have to ask Gigi about that. I saw that, and I think it's fascinating. As a matter of fact, really, that material that she got with the whole Mad Scientists of Atlantis thing, again, just like with a lot of things around Gigi's work, it really is ahead of its time. So it can really add and open up the whole mystery schools question. And, so that, yeah, I'm just glad that you mentioned that one because it is powerful. But again, think back, a decade ago. I make this point a lot just so we understand. Really, the work of Gigi Young, for example, on this track, the emergence now of the Steiner work, things we've tried to do in the X series, the work of Joseph Farrell, there's a lot that's available. And this is kind of the period that we're in. Here we have arrived at a certain period in time. And when I look at those periods in time, and I've been studying them for years, but you look at a certain period from 1875 to 1950, and you've got Theosophy, Anthroposophy, the Gurdjieff work, the Casey work, and a plethora of others, Dion Fortune. So there's all this incredibly rich material that take place there. Now, there's stuff that comes after, for sure, but it is interesting that what I think the real earthquake takes place there. But I will say that in the past decade, not only have the conditions in the world become unthinkable, just like World War I was unthinkable to those people, but also the things that are rising up that we have and that we can get behind, then you start to realize you're in that timeline, you're in that time period. Very important for us to figure out. Okay.
Can we talk about Christ for a minute?
Sure.
Okay, so Golden Girl says, it makes sense because Christ is between the brothers Lucifer and Ahriman, and without Christ, we have zero power.
Well, that's true. Actually, in the sculpture that Steiner designed for the Goetheanum, he has Christ right in the middle, and you have Lucifer on one side and Ahriman on the other. And the indication is that these are things that we have to face. Now, we've already had an incarnation of Lucifer. And the Luciferians have had an impact on the culture in terms of knowledge, in terms of guiding the culture at times, but also of being a bad influence, of drawing the culture away into its thoughts and away from the earth. And it's interesting because the Ahrimanic thing comes in at a totally different level. It draws people down into the earth and wants to lock them in there. So in Steiner's cosmology, Lucifer and Ahriman, though, are working together on the track of the eighth sphere. They both want to trap humanity in that. And that's where the idea and the tale around virtual reality and meta and all the things that we've been seeing on the transhumanist side, trying to make that appealing, because the natural realm of the Ahrimanic beings is mineral. So this gets, we start to get into the cosmology and the mystery information on this side of it. So now we're going to go a little bit deeper on that with some of these quotes. All right, these are actually about the war of all against all, and I do want to make sure we get those in. So I am going to start off with those. I have a lot. Look at how much that's ridiculous. That's a good 3 shows right there, everyone. All right. For it is that which separates man from one another, which brings them to the great war of all against all, not only to the war of nation against nation, for the conception of a nation will then no longer have the significance it possesses today. Yeah, we're already seeing a lot of that. But to the war of a single person, each single person against every other person in every branch of life. To the war of class against class, caste against caste, and sex against sex. Thus, in every field of life, I will become the apple of discord, and hence we may say that it can lead on the one hand to the highest and on the other hand to the lowest. For this reason, it is a two-edged sword. The war of all against all is an harmonic impulse. And the idea ultimately, and this goes really deep, is that the right side of the body will be at war with the left side of the body. We've talked about the split in the schools from right and left. We've seen the incredible divisions in society between, the young and the old, the rich and the poor, men and women, the races, and all the things that have been cooked up along these lines. Another quote on this tip: the war of all against all will be an expression of the egotism that's already growing stronger, the egotism conjured forth by humanity today as the I is, and will always become stronger and stronger. That will be the end of the last post-Atlantean culture. This catastrophe will also have its mission, its usefulness in the ascent of the entire human race. However, the great war of all against all will be something much worse than war of the present day with weapons. It will be a war of souls who no longer understand one another, a war of the classes. This future catastrophe is difficult for present-day consciousness to understand. So the war of all against all is what this is the breeding ground that we're seeing now, where everyone's not supposed to get along with anyone else. And if you say, oh, I'm, pro-COVID or something, and, oh, I'm anti-mask, all that nonsense, right? They had people at each other's throats over that. They promoted a false Black Lives Matter movement, which didn't help any minority anywhere. It just fattened up the pro-communist leaders of that movement to get big fancy houses and $6 million incomes. So, but they needed to do their job to, whip up people against each other. And this is what those groups at that controlling level are doing. So when we get into the World Economic Forum types, when we get into that level, and for sure there are things, behind the scenes that we don't hear about and don't know about. And it's easy just to say World Economic Forum. However, at the same time, those are the controlling bodies on the corporate side, and they control the puppet politicians that they're rolling out. So therefore, in my opinion, it is accurate to go there in a way. People used to go into the Bilderberg group in that fashion, because the World Economic Forum holds a similar place, but it's even much more, it has much bigger of an impact, and they're more shameless. So therefore, I think that when we look at it this way, we can start to get it in our heads. They're all about division. They have to be, because the occult vision they're trying to bring to pass relies on them causing every soul to be against every other soul. That is where their instruction comes from. That is the sort of harmonic impulse that is driving this entire consolidation, centralization. So when we look at it that way, a lot of these divisions that we're seeing and that they're trying to cook up, you remember at a certain point, they were saying, well, these people, I think it was Trudeau who said it, these people who are protesting, we shouldn't tolerate them, right? This is the Hitler message. And when they had his deputy prime minister, Chrystia Freeland, come out beside him and, give weird psychic, not psychic, but psychotic speeches, this is a moment. It was a moment to see where they're coming from. Even if their efforts, they were able to harass these truckers and take their money and all the rest. But there was another thing going on there. They were exercising, they were feeling that power out. Can we get away with this? Can we isolate a group that we say is bad? Can we bring in the domestic terrorism idea? And that was a test, and it failed. The test failed, but it gave them enough data to go back and figure it out. So let's go further with the war of all against all, unless you got something. You got something?
It's good. I got great stuff for later.
All right. So I'm saying that these leaders are into black magic and that they're exercising a kind of black magic. Well, we've heard this before, and maybe it's even been abused at times where they've been like, everybody is an occultist and, they're all Satanists and all the rest. Maybe not all of them, but there are some for sure, and that's what I want to focus on. And I don't want it to be a they're so bad, they're evil Satanists, we're so good. I want it to be, who is it that's running this picture, and what is it that they believe? And if they are being controlled by a dark occult force, we have the ability, through what the mystery schools have given us as tools, to kind of smash that open. I think that that's worthwhile to exposing their kind of dark occult roots. Otherwise, I wouldn't even have, I'd have more of a anthropology interest in it. Okay, the Atlanteans were magicians. As we today use the powers asleep in a coal, so the Atlantean used the forces in plant seeds. The forces in the seeds serve them in their technology and their industry. Here is Steiner going back into what the ancient advanced groups had. But here he's saying they're magicians. Now, when they turn, they become what? What we understand as black magicians. This is the heritage of the groups that we're seeing here. This is also explains their obsession with Atlantis, which they don't publicize very much, but is very well documented in the shows we've done. There's a mysterious connection between these forces. As long as the Atlanteans used the seed forces properly, they were in harmony with the working of the forces of the air and water. However, from the middle of the Atlantean age onward, the Atlantean magicians increasingly approached their moral fail, and in the mysteries of the black occult schools, these magical forces were misused. In a terrible way, they were placed in the service of the most horrible egotism. In this way, the powers of air and water were increasingly excited, which finally had to result in the mighty Atlantean water catastrophe. Today, those who know the secret of the use of these forces know full well that the use of such forces in our times means that the powers of black magic are at work. Magic must never be made to serve when selfish purposes are involved. Hence, the employment of seed forces is not permitted today, even to serve white magic. So you see, there's a clear understanding in Steiner's work. Now let's go into Steiner's head for a minute. He's somebody who's been initiated into the mysteries. He's been a part of a mystery school now for many years, and he had to make a public mystery school, just like Blavatsky had to make a public mystery school, because this is what was determined inside those schools, that they needed to have this arm out there to the public. They went in to do this because of the things we talked about. This war of scientific materialism takes place in the 1840s. The mystery schools say, in 100 years, forget it. People will be completely cut off from their spirituality. You have to let out some of this information. Their early attempts to let out that information breeds all kinds of interesting confusion and some wild stuff. I've pointed them out before, the Poughkeepsie Seer, the Fox sisters. This whole wave is the mystery schools experimenting, saying, can we let this stuff out without the society going completely chaotic? And, did it get abused when Theosophy put forward concepts? Did the Nazis grab some of those concepts? Yeah, but they had their own societies, secret societies, to do their own versions anyway. So the idea of blaming Theosophy for Nazism, which I hear sometimes, is ridiculous. But I think it is important that here is Steiner now. We're in Steiner's mind, and he is saying, look, the Atlanteans employed black magicians. And, so when you're getting into this, when you're thinking about it in the groups that control the black occult forces now, remember that they know full well the disaster that happened in Atlantis, and they want to know the tools that were employed in Atlantis, and they want to know basically how to use those tools without getting, the great blowback that the Atlanteans got. So I think that this is a crucial piece when we go into it. They understand on the mystery level, with the controlling factions, the leadership of these different countries, the UK, France, around the world, and in America certainly, that group has been running them on the dark occult side for years, for centuries. So they're very aware of these concepts. So what we need to do, I would say, to apprehend the political process and to, bring things into a balance and expose what's going on, is to be more aware of the mystery material and the things that people like Steiner, for example, are bringing forward in that period, because the more we're on their level, the more we can see what they're doing. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Whew, we're going deep here in episode X-126. And I want to remind you to go to the darkjournalist.com website, sign up for our newsletter. That's the thing that keeps us going. And it's a free newsletter, but it keeps that connection in this incredible censorship age with you. And that's crucial and valuable. And it's basically, it's the kind of thing where you'll get the newsletter once a week, and it'll let you know the incredible shows and interviews that we have coming up for you in May and June. And you're not going to want to miss these. So make sure that you stand up and be counted for that. I'm going to jump into a whole 8-sphere section here, but Miss Olivia, you're up.
Natter Butter, DJ, is it possible that these dark entities from the 8th sphere are actually soul farmers? Are they in reality using us as an ethereal farm, and we, humanity, are the crop?
Soul farmers. I think there was a group I listened to called Soul Farmers, and they were real good.
Familiar.
It does sound like a band name, let's face it. Look, yeah, I mean, it is. It's a harvesting operation. So in that sense, absolutely. There's actually a piece coming up that answers this pretty well. And it talks about when do the Ahrimanic forces show up. And so there is that harvesting that takes place. But actually, I like to think about it as farming, the way you put it. Give me one more before I hop into this.
Well, I love this question. Empress Inaya, was Ahriman ever handsome or always this monstrous looking?
Well,
is it somehow a reflection of his character? Did he come out? Was he created that way?
Steiner, you have to remember Steiner is tuning into and getting impressions of. And some of the things that he described, as I mentioned, are, getting heavy, feeling like granite. And Ahriman's face is a reflection very often of that kind of, it's got a very grim, lifeless quality to it. It's just steeped in materiality. It's become, it's in mundane earth. It's in mundane process. And so I think it kind of just reflects the evil that it is. And, and I think it's interesting, of course, on Earth, things are illusion, are Maya. You can see things that are really beautiful with a lot of evil behind them. So I think what we're getting with Steiner taking the snapshot of Ahriman is a real glimpse from that sort of astral level of what the meaning of this entity was. But he encountered this being a number of times. So in glimpses and things. And I feel what's missing when people study Steiner, and they want to study him from a number of different levels. I can appreciate it. They've done a great job. But I don't understand. The Ahriman pot has really been missed, in my opinion, because basically he's going along and doing this work, getting deeper and deeper, Steiner is. And he realizes that the Ahrimanic power is the thing that is the great challenge to humanity, and that is the great danger, and how it interrupts the evolutionary track that we would normally go on. In Steiner's cosmology, that evolutionary track creates a new Earth as new Jupiter, right? That is basically New Jerusalem, in a sense. It is the perfected world out of all the things that we do. That's a long evolutionary 4 million year track. These beings are, they're all about recreating that track in their image, right? So they want to kind of interrupt our natural spiritual evolution to have it convert into this 8th sphere piece. And what happens is, instead of having the reunification with the spiritual world after death and moving into these different levels, like in the mystery schools, what happens after you die is you go to different planetary bodies, and it's like school. And you go into different systems and all the rest. And then you come back to Earth and you learn things. This is a building process. what they want to do in Steiner's work around the eighth sphere, what they're trying to build is a grid that prevents you from doing that normal track and loops you back in. And part of that is by feeding you the false impressions when you're here physically in this life. So this is, these are long-term programs, and this is a big cosmology he's describing. But if we can grasp and bring it down, we can actually get Steiner, on one hand, pointing out what is the thing that he's learned really over the 5 decades that he studied. Ahriman is the great challenge for humanity. That's what he's trying to point out. And the Ahriman thread is laced throughout so many of the different things he laid out there. We're going to get into some of that. I mentioned C.G. Harrison earlier. And what's interesting is C.G. Harrison writes a book called The Transcendental Universe, and it's 6 lectures. He's a strange figure, and he comes out and gives these lectures for something called the Berrien Society, which is also a lot of questions. Who are the Berrien Society? Well, they're in London, and they're involved with the mystery schools, but these are public lectures. So this is the eighth sphere piece. So this is how we're going to understand virtual reality 1 and things like meta, and how they're trying to set up and encompass your consciousness into a device, so that instead of inhabiting your consciousness in a physical reality, you project your consciousness into a device. And we've seen Musk talk about this. All of these people on that level, they're all very familiar with mystery teachings one way or another, whether you think that they're into black magic or if they're familiar with these types of mystery teachings. For sure, they know that you can't project your consciousness into a cube and, have it be your avatar or whatever, which is how Musk talks, which is absurd. And that's why I don't trust a lot of the moves from Musk and Starlink and all that with Twitter and everything else. But I see as something very different. Now, check this out. This is interesting. If you get into the mindset that you can project your consciousness in somewhere, like they're trying to have you project your consciousness into meta and that whole phony world that they're creating, and you're going to have exchanges there and like have friends there and all that stuff, that is basically plugging your mind consciousness directly into a different realm. And that's kind of like training ground for the eighth sphere, because what it does is it looses you into your imagination. It projects your consciousness into this thing when your consciousness is in your physical body. Now, your consciousness arises in your physical body. Anyone who's familiar with mystery teachings will know, through your endocrine system and through the connection of what they call in psychic terms the silver cord, pituitary and pineal and Leydig centers. That requires a physical body to have that. So you have to have the physical body to do that. You can take that consciousness and, you can teleport yourself or, teleport your consciousness to see other things. These are the abilities that people have, but you can't plug your consciousness into a device. And because it requires your physical body. So that and this goes back to the Matrix movie and everything else. So that we're dealing with a very insidious type of implication when you get into that. So that's something we need to understand in relation to what's happening now in the eighth sphere. Yeah, what do you got?
I love this. Darla Cash. The Cheyenne people have the faceless man, a dark thief, a dangerous and fretful spirit that showed up on the reservation in the 1950s. They considered it the embodiment of corporatism. Somehow related.
Look, from what I've seen in corporate America, they're probably right. For me, it's interesting because I think that the Native American tribes and individuals have naturally are plugged into a lot of these abilities that we're talking about. And I think a lot of groups seek them out. I remember when TTSA and the CIA were doing studies on Native American groups and their legends. And I remember thinking, oh, that's a red flag if I ever saw one. But there's no question that they keep that. All right, C.G. Harrison. I'm going to go back. C.G. Harrison gives these lectures to the Berrien Society. He advertises them. People show up. And it's all very unusual. Who is this guy? And why are people showing up to his lectures? What's up with the Berrien Society? Why is he talking about the Mystery School Wars? And if you read that very small Transcendental Universe book, it is loaded with information about the Mystery School War. And then what happens? It drops off the map, but people like Steiner cite it a decade or so later. Okay, 1893, are you ready? It will be my duty to explain to the best of my ability certain facts in connection with a mystery known as the mystery of the eighth sphere. Now, I'm well aware that there are many occultists who say the subject ought not to be brought before the public at all and object to the very name being mentioned. In reply to such persons, it is due to myself to say I am breaking no oath and violating no confidence. These lectures were advertised in public journals, and all who choose to attend them are welcome. I regret to be obliged to differ from many persons who I hold in the highest respect as to whether or not the times are ripe for mentioning these subjects. I want to say Steiner kind of ran into this as well. But it's interesting how much of a secret the eighth sphere is. Remember, Steiner said before it was accidentally and wrongly revealed by A.P. Sinnett, who was a theosophical writer in esoteric Buddhism, he said that it was one of the biggest secrets that the mystery schools held. That's interesting, too. These lectures were advertised in public journals, yes. Okay. They've been mentioned prudently or imprudently and are familiar for all who have taken interest in the theosophical movement. The first person, however, to profane the mysteries was Mr. Sinnett, the author of Esoteric Buddhism, a book which made considerable sensation when it came out, but which contains nothing new that is true and nothing true that is new. Obviously, he didn't like the book. That book is a massive seller, and in fact is it's the second top seller of any theosophical book. So you've got Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine book, and then A.P. Sinnett's. That's number 2. So it is a sensation. In that period, he was the first to make public the information that there is an eighth sphere. And I'm going to explain the spheres in a moment. And a mystery connected with it of which he is ignorant. It may well be as well to say that both of these statements are true, but when he proceeds to say that the eighth sphere is the moon, he gives utterance to one of those half-truths that are more misleading than falsehoods. Readers of Esoteric Buddhism will remember that man is said therein to evolve on 7 planets, 3 of which, including the Earth, are visible, and the other 4 composed of matter, too attenuated to be visible. Remember that, because this is very important for the eighth sphere. Also, that there is an 8th planet, the moon, in which matter asserts itself yet more strongly. I want to say something that's interesting about this too, which is they hadn't discovered Pluto yet. That's discovered in 1930. But they were aware of Uranus, and for some reason, it's not included. And I find that interesting too. But anyway, anything more utterly misleading, it is impossible to conceive. Madame Blavatsky, who knew very well that this kind of thing was sure to be exposed sooner or later, has in her secret doctrine corrected some of the errors before Steiner did. But as she has not chosen to elucidate any portion of the mystery except such as to suit her purpose, she is destitute, moreover, of the literary gifts of her disciple. Her teaching in respect to the 7 planets in the 8th sphere will be caviar to the general, who will continue to regard Mr. Sinnett's explanation as the genuine esoteric Buddhism. So this is interesting. In that period, there's a dispute when this comes out. And so the mystery schools have to become public. So this figure Harrison, representing a group of mystery schools, has to come out and give these 6 lectures. And he exposes a lot of things about theosophy and what happened to Blavatsky, including the fact, and I'm going to read Steiner's quote on this, that there was something called a renegade Mahatma And this is interesting because she had a master that had guided her, who was one of the ascended masters named Kuthumi, through her life. And there was someone who was in these mystery schools who basically decided to become a spy. And what he had the ability to do was to impersonate Kuthumi. And part of the program for taking down Blavatsky was this Mahatma impersonating Kuthumi to her, and her developing a psychic confusion as a result. But we can see that in this layer of information coming out, this strange battle is taking place among the mystery schools. There's a lot going on. And to think that all these groups are associated very early on with, things that would happen in World War II. Benjamin Disraeli, as I mentioned earlier, who becomes the Prime Minister of Britain, was in the Orphic Circle. So there's something going on here where the mystery school influence and the political part, there's a lot of push-pull everywhere with this idea that the mystery schools are going to come out with this knowledge, almost like people are freaking out that they're going to be exposed or someone's going to give out the wrong information. And in the case of the Eighth Sphere, a very deep secret inside the mystery schools was revealed too early and wrongly. So this gives us some idea of the importance, let's say, of this concept we're talking about tonight, the Eighth Sphere, that Steiner brings forward and really hangs a lot of emphasis on in terms of the 21st century period that we're in here. Okay, so I'm gonna take a little bit more of that Blavatsky piece, and then I'm going to jump out of that, and I'm going to round out Steiner's version of the Eighth Sphere, and then we'll take your questions. I'm running late. Let's
just keep going. We'll do a long show,
right.
Even longer than usual.
No, I'll tighten it up. I'll tighten all this up. Okay. Here's a quote from Steiner that I think reflects very well on the period that we're in terms of the media, the wars, the war of all against all, and so on, especially with the propaganda that we're seeing and the censorship around it. Quote, "History cannot be permanently falsified. The myth cannot stand up to the scrutiny of scientific research. The sinister web will be brought into the light and torn to pieces, however artfully it has been spun." Now, it's interesting because Steiner there is quoting himself from an academic paper, and he doesn't say where it comes from, but that is one of his quotes about the period that he's in there with World War I. I feel that this is important for us. History cannot be permanently falsified. We've looked at a lot of false history from JFK, 9/11, the COVID op. I mean, this thing just keeps going. So the fact that it can't be and it will be unraveled is pretty dramatic when you think about those things coming out. I want to say also that there's a piece about the root races in relation to Russia. So whenever Russia's involved on the world stage and we're looking at world wars and things of this nature, remember there's a deeper level that we're coming in from. Okay. I've told you before, this is Steiner again, that in certain secret brotherhoods in the West, I have proof of this. There was talk in the 1890s about the present war, World War I. The pupils of these brotherhoods were given instructions by means of maps which showed how Europe was to be changed by this world war. Europe was to be changed. The English brotherhoods in particular discussed a war that was to take place indeed, that was to be guided into being and properly prepared. I'm speaking of facts, but there are certain reasons why I have to refrain from drawing maps for you, though I could quite easily show and draw for you the maps which figured in the teachings of those Western secret brotherhoods. These secret brotherhoods, together with everything affiliated to them, were counting on tremendous revolutions that were to take place between the Danube and the Aegean Sea, between the Black Sea and the Adriatic, in connection with the great European war they were discussing. Every sentence I say here is quite deliberate. One of the sentences which figured in their discussions, and which I shall quote more or less literally, went, "As soon as the dreams of Pan-Slavism have developed just a little further, A good deal will take place in the Balkans, which is in accord with the developments in Europe. They meant in accord with the secret brotherhoods. This is one great network that I want to bring to your awareness. The dreams of Pan-Slavism were discussed over and over again by these secret brotherhoods. So here is Steiner saying there's a map in 1890s, and he has proof of it, which showed the outline of how the world would look after World War I. But what's interesting to me there is, you might have said, well, military groups plan this or that. He's saying the mystery schools are doing this, certain mystery brotherhoods. So we're seeing that the mystery schools are involved directly then in these wars. Obviously, there's a huge split in those schools because the schools that are trying to move that culture forward have nothing to do with wanting war. So he's making us aware, and he's saying this is one great network that I want to bring to your awareness. So it's one great network that we're getting into our awareness. Okay, let's go even further. So he's talking about the ability for the schools to make changes in relation to, and this is from a lecture called The Karma of Untruthfulness, which is 1919. And he's saying, you know, they have to employ certain types of spiritualistic abilities in order to accomplish certain things. They have to employ certain types of occult rituals, etc. So he says, it has to be taken into account that wherever human beings work with the help of spiritually effective forces, whether for good or evil intent, they have to reckon with long stretches of time. Because of this account must also be taken to the fact that much depends on the ability of the individual to grasp and use the conditions on the physical plane with a certain cold-blooded attachment. These types of occultists aren't trying to move the culture forward. They have a certain type of aim or angle, and they just need to do it in a non-emotional fashion, not using any conscience. During the course of my description, you'll doubtless see whether something is striven for or achieved with good or bad intent. One characteristic of those who make use of spiritual forces is that very frequently, not always, but very frequently, they have reasons for not wishing to appear on the stage of the physical plane. Instead, they make use of intermediaries through whom certain plans can be realized. Except for Biden, Trudeau, Jacinda, we're starting to get the picture. Often these things have to be done in such a way that others do not notice what is going on. I've already pointed out a number of times that people are in a way inattentive. Gee, they were inattentive in 1919. This is 100 years later, and I think people are really inattentive now. I have already pointed out a number of times that people are in a way inattentive. They do not like looking closely at what is going on. Many of those who work in certain occult connections in order to bring something about in the world make use of this fact. Those of us who see the world not in the usual way, but with free and open eyes, will know that there are people who can be influenced by those who want to make use of such means. Someone who is intent on influencing people, someone who is an occultist, not entirely scrupulous, can indeed gain power over people this way. Let me start right at the beginning and take an example, and you'll find it startling. And he gives a series of examples. But again, here we have it. The reason is the dullness of the culture. They can't perceive that anybody is doing this to them. So this is part of the piece I think we need to grasp. And also, it's not to hang around and be paranoid about the subject. That's not going to be helpful. And to see, a Satanist around every corner. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about looking out at that large plan and seeing that these mystery groups and those who are not working for moving the culture forward, the left-hand groups, have a complete grip over the political process at this point. And what we need to do, it seems like the thing that Steiner is impressing over and over again is that it's one thing for them to do it, but it's another for us to be caught completely unawares. So when we move into this realm of becoming aware that they're planning the war of all against all, that they've set up this eighth sphere reality to project a false virtual reality into, where the human being, the human spirit, becomes trapped. And it's all because of these impulses of these larger dark astral forces. Then we're getting into starting to understand, this is how we get lured into the trap. And we're seeing it. We're already I've seen people get so lured into that trap that their entire life trajectory that they were on, they just got, it's almost like a tractor beam came in and sucked them up. So what's interesting is as time goes by, the Steiner material becomes even more vividly real. I have a lot more to go.
Keep going for a minute.
But we're gonna jump to questions as soon as you're ready. Okay, because it's already we're in.
Catch up.
A couple things I wanted to point out just about imagery in relation to the eighth spheres. The early tarot decks. I did a show and I did a lot of investigation around these early tarot decks. One of the decks, which was the Montaigne Tarocchi, yes. And it's interesting too because Tarocchi, what they were originally going to be these cards that denoted a family, an educational tool for a very well-adjusted family, so like the rich elite who are living in Italy in the 15th century. These cards show up out of the blue. And what they are, in fact, is a mystery signature that become a foundation of a different type of tarot tradition. But what's interesting about them is the way that they slide into the culture through this, these families can say, well, I'm using this as an educational tool for my child. In there, of course, is the eighth sphere card. And I've studied how this came about, and I've seen alternate versions of it. And, of course, the eighth sphere, has had traditional meanings as well. But I think what we're getting in this particular deck is a version of that. Those people are very aware of this thing. And as we know, with Steiner calling it one of the biggest secrets of the mystery schools in this period, this is a way for them to slowly educate the child and the family about this, using this. Some of the other early pieces of this deck have fascinated me. This is the Venus card from that deck, which I think really shows the otherworldliness quality of the Venus piece. Another one revealing the lion heart connection in occult terms. The secret groups actually know very well that the development of the human heart came about through the influence of the lion. And so this is one of those very interesting echoes. One of the weirdest cards in that deck is the sun. And as we can see, this person is bringing the sun up, and there's a child sort of jumping or being thrown out of a chariot there as it heads up there. And there's a scorpion just hanging out there. All these different symbols, including this in particular, you see as a recurring theme over and over again. And I've heard explanations that it's supposed to be Icarus and all the rest, but I don't buy that. I think there's something else very profound going on with this particular Tarocchi card. And in that era, there's another version. Again, it's Octavia Spira, the eighth sphere. We're getting that impression that they're given that occult teaching and understanding the importance of that sphere. Another piece that goes along with this is more into the X-steganography in the same era, but again, giving out that impulse that the sun and the X-steganography deeply, deeply related. Yes.
CJ, do you think that these cards are tools to develop one's mystical vision?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm reminded of Sister Wendy, who used to be on PBS, and she was this wonderful nun
Oh my
with
God.
terrible teeth, and she was the greatest She was an art historian, and
Yes.
oh my God. So, but what she would do, she lived all alone in a trailer, on a grounds on a. She didn't live in the abbey with the other nuns. She lived separately, and she would take a picture, a print of a piece of artwork, and she would live with it day in and day and night. And she would study it. She'd see it out of the corner of her eye. She'd meditate on it, and it would sort of reveal itself to her, the meaning, the symbolism, and just aspects of it, and that is how you look at art. That's how you truly perceive it and become sort of one with the creator of the art. So I don't know, I haven't thought of Sister Wendy in a long time, but I just thought of her now.
Esoteric art, what Gurdjieff would call objective art, there's a huge wing of anthroposophy that is deep, deep on the art side. We remember, of course, that there was an artist that came to Steiner and was doing all these kind of Klimt type pieces, very, very unusual. And also doing this kind of Kandinsky type of really, really deep images. And what happened was he said, you can't let these out to the public yet because of the concepts you've embedded in them. You realize that. And she said, when can I let them out? And the story goes along. And it basically, he said somewhere in 50 to 75 years. And there was, in fact, a showing of those paintings, and they are very interesting. There's a few different painters that show up in the anthroposophical story when we're talking about this. So the art aspect, it breaks through, just like symbolism is the function of the higher emotional center. It goes like dreams, they go very far beyond just conversation, and it is more about the symbol of the thing that you see. So we're dealing there with higher centers that we've kind of forgotten how to use, and yet are so important and are there. They're just latent now. They need to be awakened, and it is through the study, and certainly through the art, that can awaken you. Aha, this is what happens. But yeah, that's a really interesting one.
Karen Carpenter, could Daniel say more about the role of the lion? He touched on in the cards. We hear about lion-hearted, etc.
Oh, so interesting. Well, Steiner develops a cosmology based on the idea that there was a whole preparatory period for humanity on other planets before that stream of humanity came down here. And that when we came here, there was a developmental stage which was kind of terrifying, where the moon was inside the Earth and was leaving. So that sort of trauma is echoed actually in Beelzebub's Tales, which is Gurdjieff's book. That is so it's kind of like the James Joyce Gurdjieff book. It's not the simple one to read. But so there's something about this event that creates such an upside down quality in humanity. And they see things upside down because it was just too terrifying to witness all this. And during the period of humanity's development, the lion becomes such a crucial aspect for the development of the human heart. And we evolve into a totally different being as a result of that interaction in the evolution of taking on that lion development of the heart. So there's a great sort of esoteric symbolism to this connection between the lion and humanity. And of course, we still find that, it's that whole idea of the admiration of courage. And it's used heavily in all sorts of different types of esoteric literature. Yeah.
Hold on, I get such a good question.
Including The Wizard of Oz. It's just the opposite.
Okay, so Tommy Connolly says the Montaigne deck has 5 suits. 1, the social stations of humanity. 2, the 9 muses and Apollo. 3, the liberal arts. 4, the cardinal virtues. and 5, the heavenly spheres. We should just do a show on these cards one day. It sounds so fascinating.
No question. They were included in an early X series episode, and I remember getting incredible feedback on it. And I spent some time with them, but they reappeared in relation to looking at the early development of the mystery schools when they were planning to let things out. And I was thinking particularly about the Rosicrucians, and whenever we get around Italy, France, in that period, I see this is the Rosicrucian stream moving around. That one's interesting. I'm going to go with a quick Eighth Sphere quote on this, and then we'll move to your next question.
Okay.
All right. From what is now happening, a few souls must come to a realization that we cannot go on like this. Sound familiar? Human evolution must take up the spiritual. Materialism is confronting its karma in this, the most terrible of all wars. In a certain sense, this war is the karma of materialism. The more this fact is realized by human beings, the more they will abandon their arguments about who is to blame for the war. And then they will have to realize that this war has been sent into world history to admonish man to turn to spiritual perception of human life in its entirety. We did go through those 2 world wars, and here's Steiner in the middle of it saying, look, this thing is a disaster, and it has to be the wake-up call for humanity. It wasn't. We're right now sending arms into Ukraine, and the Russians are talking about using nuclear weapons, and we're funding all this military industrial junk. So we haven't learned anything, unfortunately. We learned something when Gorbachev and Reagan got together and discussed the 0 options around nukes, and also negotiated the first real reductions in nuclear weapons. This shouldn't be a problem anymore. But here we are again, and it's because we have this psychotic leadership, which is somehow a mirror reflection of the state of unawareness on the side of the public. Okay, a little further. Everything that passes into the 8th sphere disappears from Earth evolution, does not go forward in the right way with Earth evolution. This is important. The 8th sphere is a totally different evolutionary track. This is the thing that's being set up through transhumanism. These are the occult underpinnings of what that transhumanism is all about. If one were to rely only on what is taking place in the physical world, there would be little hope for the successful continuation of the spiritual movement through which a spiritual scientific worldview is to be cultivated. And I think that that's kind of crucial, because how can we get to, having faith that somehow the spiritual here is going to triumph and that humanity is going to move forward in the proper way? Here's a little more on this tip. One of the things that he senses is that the awareness of life after death is going to be one of the awareness tools that will help us, but also that those on the other side will be helpful in this process. This is another thing that's going on, which is there's the side of those who have moved on that are trying to help us here. If one were to rely only on what is taking place in the physical world, there'd be little hope for the successful continuation of the spiritual movement through which a spiritual scientific worldview is to be cultivated. Recently, a good and faithful colleague, age 30 or so, died. My words to the soul that had gone through the gate of death requested that it should continue to work in our spiritual scientific field as faithfully and as courageously as it had done here on earth. Utilizing all of its acquired knowledge, this colleague had worked diligently with us here on the physical plane. My message to him for his life in between death and rebirth was that he should continue to work with us after death as he had done in life. For we are counting on these so-called dead as we are counting on the living. Our spiritual scientific worldview must be alive to such a degree that the gap between the so-called dead and the living can be overcome. We must feel that the dead among us as if they were alive. We want not only theory, but life. Thus, we wish to point out that when there is peace, there will be a living tie between those on earth and those who have gone through the gate of death. man will be able to learn and must learn from the dead how they contribute to the great spiritual progress that must take hold on earth. I think that's particularly powerful because, we want to know that this is a cooperative thing and that those great souls that have moved beyond are still in the process of helping us in between the different lives that they're having. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is episode X-126. We're going deep, deep here with the Rudolf Steiner information on the war of all against all and the eighth sphere and the Ahrimanic warning that Steiner left for us. Of course, we're taking your questions here. I want to remind everyone, if you haven't already, go to the darkjournalist.com website and sign up for our newsletter. That definitely helps us to stay in touch through the massive wave that we're seeing of censorship and, the mainstream media just celebrating, another channel got censored and we're taking these people off. And the things that we've been hearing about the deplatforming and the defunding of the independent media, definitely shameful for a culture that, is dedicated itself supposedly to moving forward. Where's that idea of moving forward when you can't speak your mind and say the things that are true? When telling the truth becomes, the greatest crime, then, you really are in an upside down society. And that really what the censorship gets to. One of the ways for us to get around that is that newsletter. And it's a free newsletter. It shows up once a week and lets you know the incredible shows that we have coming up for you. And all kinds of things for the summer. Events, interviews, documentaries. You won't believe it. So make sure that you stand up and be counted. Yes, Miss
Okay, we're going to go for it. Because Dark Journalist will go there. David Tormina is asking, DJ, do you suspect that the Roe v. Wade leak was an intentional act meant to force the public to contemplate child sacrifice? Is it a source of power for Ahriman that we must face now?
I saw it a little bit differently. I saw it as an escape valve for a flailing op that was going on, which is the COVID op, and the flailing administration that's been trying to push domestic terror. It's really interesting. I'm going to turn your question upside down for a moment, but it is still in the current news arena, which is, we had all these things come out about, we're going to have Elon Musk give us free speech on Twitter and all this stuff, right? Which is ridiculous. He doesn't even own the platform yet, by the way. The deal is still going through. And you had all these people being like, please, be good to us, Elon, or whatever. I don't know what is going on with some of that stuff. But anyway, what's interesting to me is right next to that operation is what? This Disinformation Governance Board, DGB, like KGB, right? I just did a report on it on Tuesday. And, what we're talking about is if you say something that steps out of line or is against this administration, they have the ability to shut you down and prosecute you. That's literally what it is. So that is a Stasi state. There's no question about it. So therefore, the timing on how these things are leapfrogging around, one side comes out and it's like, hey, it's a gift to the right-wing piece, and they're supposed to be all about free speech and all the rest. And then here's a gift to the left-wing piece, we're going to stifle all speech. Don't worry about it. We'll shut up everyone that you don't agree with. We'll silence them. We'll deplatform them. We'll prosecute them. And that's where we got the whole thing about Nina and Scary Poppins and all the rest of it. So what they're engaged in is like a matching movement. So what they have at the top there is someone who has mental cognition issues, can't run the country. So another group is running the country through him. And, his incredible drop in the ratings, the incredible mismanagement of the economy, the worst inflation ever, and the general kind of miasma of what they're building, including the fact that they go out there and the only thing they seem to get excited about talking about is war and food shortages. Have you noticed that? And then they had Stepford Biden rolled out for the press event, and he's laughing there as the comedian's like, inflation's up to 8.2%. Ha, 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 and he's sitting there laughing like, hey, Joe has a sense of humor, it's crazy time, right? It is like
well, they're not going to go hungry. They're
Yes.
not going to become homeless.
True. It's like Nero. I mean, that's how it feels.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
But exactly. So you're destroying people's lives. They're getting thrown out of their homes because in some cities, the real estate rates have gone up 24%. And those people, we've seen stories of them living in camps on the side of the road. And this is getting covered more. I'm seeing more about it, not on mainstream, but, this is what that whole thing is about. So therefore, when they came out with the Roe v. Wade thing, first of all, the Supreme Court does not leak. It doesn't happen. So therefore, in doing this, they were trying to create something that would create a furor. And they did for about a day and a half, and it still ripples. But, even the media has been like, okay, well, we don't really know what's going on, so just hang in there. But they wanted this trial balloon because they need to change the trajectory of what's going on here, which is Biden is sinking like a rock. He got us involved in this terrible war in Ukraine. He's sending arms, money, and all this stuff to Ukraine while his own people are suffering. And he's a disaster. And they need to change that narrative because, let me tell you, Nina and all the rest of it, no matter how many tools you use to shut down speech, the message is going to get out. The only thing that they can do is use emergency powers. They need something. They need to activate continuity of government because this is the level that they're at. They can't accomplish things otherwise. And so I believe that they're looking for an event that will drive open the door of emergency powers, continuity of government. Remember, technically, we're under emergency powers and run by Northcom now ever since the September 11th attacks, and every president, Biden, Trump, Obama, Bush, all sign on to it, left or right. So how different can that split be? So that's kind of a long answer to your question, but
right,
there you go.
But we don't have martial law yet.
Not yet. And this is important because, look, the period of stress that Steiner went through in World War I, he's right in the middle of it. Okay, he had to move his base to neutral Switzerland just to survive the attacks. So, he understands being on the front line of this. And so we can get a lot, just as the Gurdjieff work with Ouspensky came out at the Russian Revolution period. These are great things that happen in the middle of the incredibly stressful things that we're facing, and they're tools to use from those groups. Yes.
I just wanted to mention, Occult Fan says, I just came from the new Doctor Strange 2. All of these ideas in tonight's show are being put forward in it. They even name drop the Illuminati.
Oh, wow.
Might be worth watching.
Sounds great. I haven't heard of this one. I'll have to check it out.
Okay, so I have a bunch that are kind of connected. So Shamanist Anamkara says, from Steiner's Lecture 7, Future Jupiter and Its Beings, January 1915, Dornoch, quote, but immoral behavior imprints a demonic form on it. Demons are born through man's immoral conduct, unquote. Robert Ayala says, what is Ahriman's intentions through the perception of Steiner? Najat Madri, who is studying Steiner, says, believe it or not, Ahriman is a teacher of humanity. Ahrimanic is part of human evolution. It challenges humanity to evolve to higher consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, the way that a very negative experience can be turned positive. I don't think that Ahriman, is going to be up there giving a Sermon on the Mount or anything like that. So it's crucial. It has to be faced. It's one of those things. And it is, in a way, facing our own dark mirror, right? Because when you get into the way that Steiner describes it, remember, Steiner's taking on Ahriman this way. Look, there's a dark force that's connected itself at a crucial period in human history on planet Earth. And that period where Ahriman got the upper hand in the Steiner story is when the moon was leaving. And this caused such a physically and otherwise, there were all kinds of ripples from this. This is one of those kind of apotheum style ripples that are recorded back there. And so Ahriman's powers came in. And what happens is there's a period in this cosmology where the solar beings need to withdraw for all this to happen. And the solar being who decides to stay behind is Yahweh. And this is interesting because there are a lot of pieces to think about with this. But anyway, Yahweh becomes the savior of Earth by defending it against Ahriman. And that's where we get the setup for the Bible. Now, when we think about this and we draw it back into Steiner's version of Ahriman, what he's talking about, basically this force became a part of the evolution of Earth. So now as we evolve, this thing is with us. So at a certain point, what he's saying is it's not the kind of thing to run away from and be like, I'm not going to deal with this. It is to face it and to come through that experience, move through it, and then evolve as a result of that. But it is an incredibly, so I would agree with what Najat said actually, which was that it is for humanity to evolve, but it's sort of like, you know, just like in the Steiner work, The Dweller on the Threshold is a terrifying sight to behold. But in order to advance into the spiritual world, you need to pass, you know, the Dweller on the Threshold. So it has that kind of fairy tale aspect. The Ahriman thing, humanity is in the middle of facing off against this. And here is humanity trying to advance and people being like, hey, you know, I'm going to use technology. And, you know, I've had a fascination for technology for years. But as they've got into this and got excited about it, just as they were doing it, suddenly they realized, oh my God, this machine, this thing is surveilling me. And it's taking my rights to free speech away. And oh my God, it wants to like put me in a camp, you know. So this is the thing. So the harmonic impulses behind the people using the technology, in fact, is the problem. And what it's going to take is humanity not being unawares in dealing with it. If we are unawares, then we fall victim, fall prey to this thing. That is really the key, the core. It's not an anti-technology thing at all. In fact, what it shows is that the technology needs to be the servant. And this is what the great scientists discovered when they let off the atomic bomb. They said, you know what? They did all the right things. They were just being scientists. They were put to a task. They were in a war and all the rest of it. But what did they release? Oppenheimer and others, he was like, oh my God. And he quoted the Upanishads, now I have become death, the destroyer of worlds. So you have to be careful about the abilities that you have and what use they can be put to. And so that's why what you do, just like cloning, needs to be done. You know, there has to be an ethical board overseeing that. It can't be a profit-driven thing. And, you know, it's so interesting with so many of the things, you know, I don't talk much about abortion on the show because people have so many different types of opinions about it. Here's one thing I can say pretty clearly. The pharmaceutical companies cashing in when somebody has a late-term abortion is a sick process. So, you know.
Right. It's like, can't we all agree on that?
Yes.
Except for the people who are actually financially profiting from it.
Right.
I mean, everybody else on either side can kind of agree that that's not cool.
Well, think about how insincere it is on the part of news agencies to be like, oh, you know, you can't say anything about it and this is all great, because they're being fed all the money and all the PowerPoints by the pharmaceutical companies. So, you know, we have to get clear about what this stuff is. And so, you know, I think that, you know, honest people can have good debates about things that happen in society and political positions to take and all the rest of it. But, you know, that kind of sick cashing in on the part of the pharmaceutical companies is obvious. Anyone can see that that is what's taking place. Those are the types of things that should be called out. Yes.
Karen Carpenter, is Ahriman an egregore made from our collective lower thoughts and energies?
Well, he certainly is inflated by us using our lower thoughts and energies. So, for example,
so he's energized by.
Yeah, I would say like when a case happens, like a serial killer case where they're like, that's very Ahrimanic activity in capturing the consciousness. Even in this period, it's not Steiner, but it's Ledbetter actually, who talks about how newspaper accounts create a gigantic, horrifying thought form that if you are astrally inclined, you can see, because they're chasing around after, sensationalized stories of different types of crime, which we see all the time. So if the mystery schools teach thoughts are things, and I remember there's one reading where Casey says, they're like, how literal do you mean that thoughts are things? And he says, as literal as a pin in the hand. Well, that's pretty literal. So, once in a while you say, you hear people say, well, if people just had a virtual reality place where they could go and they could rape and pillage and do all this stuff and get it out of their system, and they could go back and have a normal life, whatever. No, you're creating a huge thought form. And it is, that thought form is going to get picked up by the subconscious of humanity. So the idea, in fact, would be to do the opposite. It would be to train your mind to think of a more productive, constructive thing to do. So, can
I comment on that for a second? I mean, it's also the idea that you should have, if somebody was talking about this, you should have really good, not only kind of realistic online porn for pedophiles, because then they
right.
But it does not work. You always need to escalate it, because at a certain, when you're an addict, right, you don't get the same amount of pleasure.
No, go back and explain though how this was presented.
Well, they were gonna, I can't remember now.
Oh, okay. But this is an interesting story. That's what I thought you had it handy. But here's the interesting thing, and you're absolutely right. That story was that they were presenting this idea that for pedophiles, they were just going to create this kind of virtual reality playground, right? Mm-hmm. This is it. And the idea, again, exactly like what we were talking about, but instead what it does is it creates what? It creates a greater and greater desire, and that whole thought form, it normalizes it in the mind of that person. So,
and it will have to escalate at a certain point.
Yes.
That is the point, that is, if we have to know ourselves as humans, is that whatever we want, we kind of, you do it a bunch of times and you get bored with it and you need to escalate it, right? You need to, perversions get more deeper, perverse.
Any
right?
psychologist would tell
absolutely, you that. And you get more exotic. If you, it's sort of, you're never going to be satisfied with the same thing forever. Right. Just on a light note, I remember Christy Brinkley's husband saying, at a certain point, you look over and you go, "Yeah, I had enough of that." I mean, Christy Brinkley, right? So I mean, it's just true.
Unbelievable, yeah. That guy, he his supermodel wife, he cleans out her bank account, and Jesus, this guy. And what does he charge it all up on? Porn. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Tell me that isn't an Ahrimanic thing. Any of these addictive things, this could be helpful to us in establishing what Steiner was after on the Ahrimanic thing. Anything addictive is Ahrimanic. Pornography. The way that people become addicted to it. They had all these reports from the State Department that people were spending half their time in there who are just watching porn, and they had this same thing in the UK. So there's a weird kind of sickness that goes along with the addictive aspects of these things, and we've always seen addiction. It's come through in a number of different ways. We've developed all kinds of tools for addiction, right? Everything from AA to drug rehab programs to all these different things. And now they're kind of institutionalized to a certain degree. It's almost like, they want to make a profit by you being an addict. And then we've seen them also spill into the culture, all these different drugs and opioids and things like that. So they're taking advantage of that aspect. But they laid the foundation for a long time. Even if you go back to the 70s and the 80s, the type of power of the advertising creating this addicted culture is outrageous. The only thing I will say about that culture in relation to this culture, though, is that there's something about the entrainment from that period which doesn't hate humanity the way that this entrained culture hates humanity. And you see that in the commercials, and you see, the thing that they're glorifying is this kind of this like nonstop ego pump up. They don't want you to think 1 inch deep, right? As a matter of fact, if you think 2 inches deep, you might get thrown off every platform involved. But it is interesting. And what you said, Miss Olivia, you hit right on it, which is addiction. This is how we can understand Ahriman. Ahriman is, in the eighth sphere, is addiction. Because what do you do when you become addicted to something? You lose awareness. And basically that's when forces like that have you. So it's a good way for us to understand it. Yes.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to recommend everybody on YouTube, there are hours worth of sort of like commercials from the 80s.
Yeah.
Or Christmas shows from the 70s,
love those,
whatever.
Yeah.
But the commercials are great because you cannot believe the difference. And
the quality of the people.
First of all, it's all families. It's all families. And they are gathered around. It's like this nuclear family ideal of gathering and having whatever it is, breakfast together and playing sports together and having Sundays.
People just seem different.
It's not the hustle that it isn't fear-based. It's not so competitive. It's about quality time, and it's so much softer and people look so much healthier. And I have to say, women are so much more feminine. And
that's important too.
The men are more fit and more masculine and everything. And it's just like
you said it's not the hustle, but they did the hustle. So
what was that? 70s?
It's amazing. I agree with all of that. It makes you wonder, what is the turning point in this culture that got it over the waterfall.
I was listening to Catherine Austin Fitts the other day, and I was reminded it was 1995 when they started moving the money out of the country, and they decided that was it. It was the beginning of the destruction.
Yeah, that's on the government side. That's true. There's something in there in that. I think it could have gone either way in the 90s because the Berlin Wall had fallen. Russia, the Cold War was over. They could have taken that money and reinvested it, all that money that they spent on the Cold War, in, really creating things like high-speed rails and all this other stuff. And instead, they built up, this internet aspect and then blew our minds with 9/11, took away so many of our rights with that, when we've never got that back. And then created the more bloated financial coup culture that brought everybody down in 2008. They're building another housing crisis now. And so, every decade they have the COVID op, the UFO threat op. Listen, let me tell you something. They're working on that. They are building it. And they're counting on the public, again, being unawares and driving them by their fears. By giving them these little crumbs about, oh, look, there's a UFO committee looking into this. And my great disappointment in the alternative media is looking out at that independent media and seeing some of the worst claptrap that I've ever seen, and nobody standing up and calling it out. I mean, there's a few voices, actually, that are starting to do that, and I appreciate it. But I'll tell you, it's crucial. That field has the ability, because it has a great background. You've got great foundation from people like Stanton Friedman and John Mack and others. Don't let it go down some CIA drain with Elizondo and that whole kook show. They had Nick Pope on, and that was a weird thing too, because Pope came out and he said that seagulls could be alien drones or something like that. And then like a couple of days later, it was very strange. 60 Minutes ran a thing about this kid, who this 20-something guy who ran basically an op, like he punked the public with this thing about how birds were aliens, really, and they were part of the military drones or whatever. And then, 60 Minutes had him come on for the big reveal. It's like, where did the 60 Minutes even find out about this guy and have him on? So much of that media is so controlled. But the fact that Pope has talked about it just like the day before, this is outrageous, because here he was saying it just to get a headline or whatever. But then we also find out there's this kid out there and he does some kind of a weird thing about how seagulls are drones. Really weird things that are going on in that field. It's like hoaxers, marketeers, CIA people. And where's the real UFO story? Do we hear anywhere about good? I mean, if I was a real UFO abductee or had good sightings and stuff, I don't even know. I'd probably maybe just do my own thing with it. There is no real foundation there. There's just a weird sensationalization circus, and it's run by the CIA predominantly now, which is unfortunate because the UFO file is definitely real. And the people who have those experiences are genuine. And there's a history that we have of people going through this experience. So it should be on a totally different, far more mature level. Instead, yet, freak Nick Pope, weird stuff, attack seagulls, and Elizondo, CIA Elizondo.
All right. I'm going to ask you to sort of encapsulate the idea of Ahriman and how his influence is working through groups like the World Economic Forum and has seeped itself, it's obviously evident in technology, and how the message is getting through to all of us to obviously, hate ourselves. There's a self-loathing human that they've created.
That's important. Yeah.
Yes, especially with this climate change op, right?
Right.
That, and we know it's already started, but it's going to happen en masse, that young people will start killing themselves to save the planet. And that it's going to happen.
Yeah.
So.
Well, those types of groups have the mentality of, why should we do anything if you'll do it yourself? So instead of us going through the trouble to kill you, if we can just convince you to do it yourself.
It's not that, it's just plausible deniability also, right?
True.
Why should I murder you and, possibly pay the price if I can somehow convince you to murder yourself?
Right.
That's
so
pretty clever.
These types of groups at that level, we can see what Steiner was saying about the absence of conscience, the cold-blooded nature of it. It's very interesting because they're using techniques that are created out of a spiritual vision, really, which is techniques that have to do with occult processes. And so it's a fantastic upside down misuse of those things. And you can only imagine the terrible price that's paid from that. But it's been going on for centuries. I wanted to read a couple of quick things. I want to answer that and sort of kind of give these quotes in relation to it. Rosy Cross. Steiner says about the Rosy Cross, this is why we get that Rosicrucian feeling from him. With such feeling in our hearts, we forever want to imbue ourselves with the meaning of the Rose Cross so that we can perceive it in the proper way as the motto for our doing, weaving, and feeling. Not the black cross alone. He who tears the roses from the black cross and has nothing left but the black cross would fall into the clutches of Ahriman. The black cross in itself represents life when it strives to embrace inanimate matter. Also, if one were to separate the cross from the roses, keeping only the latter, one would not find the proper thing, for the roses, separate from the cross, tend to elevate us to a life of selfish striving toward the spiritual, but not to a life in which we reveal the spirit in the material world. Not the cross alone, not the roses alone, but the roses on the cross carrying the roses, that is our proper symbol. Pretty interesting. Pure Rosicrucian mystery school, direct from Steiner himself. This idea that you just mentioned about Ahriman and his control over these groups, this is an interesting thing because this is what Steiner suggests happens, which is at a certain level, Ahriman embraces and merges with the consciousness of people who lose spiritual sight and gain scientific knowledge to a certain point where they stop thinking for themselves and Ahriman starts thinking through them. So the Ahrimanic powers are incredibly intellectual, incredibly scientifically powerful, but their whole goal is this non-spiritual solution, where they basically are the gods and humanity is trapped, not realizing its own spiritual power. This is crucial also for the realm that Ahriman operates in, is the eighth sphere. So the more we get into projecting ourselves and, into that type of imaginary space, into that type of virtual reality without the grounding of our own mind, then that mentality of Ahriman can just take over. And so we've seen that in culture, some of the things that you were talking about with violence in movies and things like that, or this idea that if you could just let somebody in a virtual realm experience all these things. And we've seen it with the whole bizarre meta world setup that they've set up. And, I hear people are buying property in Meta.
I'm going to interrupt you and just ask a question. So these quote leaders,
yeah,
they have access to all kinds of information. They must know about reincarnation. They must know about, even though on the surface they present as scientific materialists.
Well, I've also
atheists.
said that they plan their reincarnations.
Yes, exactly. But if I just wonder, everything that I know, they must know. They have access to all the information. How do they, what is it that lures them? It seems to me that human life is, well, pretty miserable, largely. And I don't care how much money you have. I watched a wonderful video today where this spiritual woman was speaking about peace, love, and happiness, and how, it's just elusive for every one of us. And it has to be different ways to cultivate it, because that's what we're all looking for, is peace, love, and happiness. And I just wonder why they want to hook themselves permanently onto the earth plane, because they don't seem to emanate peace, love, and happiness to me. What is it that compels them to try to control the sphere, be masters of it?
I think it's a real good question. It's a strange thing, because you look at somebody like Fauci and you think to yourself, you're 81 and, you're going to slip into the netherworld soon, and all the things that you've done against humanity here, and many, many others, Kissinger and all the rest. And you think to yourself, you still want to keep playing this evil game? I think the thing is that they have become possessed by the process, so that Ahriman has actually replaced who or whatever they were, where there was a space where there was a being that the Ahrimanic force has come in and taken over. So you could just say that about somebody becoming greedy for a particular thing, or you could say it, we've seen it before. When I remember being in certain types of job situations and somebody would get a promotion, and we've all seen this, they would just start acting bizarre, because they had a little more power than anybody else. And that's just, on a one-to-one basis. Can you imagine like the type of power invested in a position like Fauci's over 4 decades? The ability to ruin careers, the ability to roll out ops, AIDS, the way that they did the AIDS operation. So, it is a great puzzlement, but I think the Ahrimanic force possesses them, and it starts thinking for them. It starts living, and at a certain point, it eats them up. One of the things that Steiner talked about to give an impression of how the Ahrimanic force harvests humanity was that it was like squeezing out a lemon. Just picture that, squeezing out a lemon. And that's what it's all about. And that's why the harvesting is so important for these beings. Now, what's fascinating is those beings and what they are. We might hear these things about them from Ahriman, from Steiner about Ahriman, but then you wonder to yourself, like, the nature and the level that we're talking on. and the types of beings that exist and our own awareness level about these things. So we're getting a spiritual teaching that is coming in through mystery centers, and it's been held. And instead, the average person has been going to church and doing these types of things. And, we come into an era where the scientific rules, and a lot of people are proud to be atheists and all the rest of it. What's interesting to me about all that is that in the sweep of culture, if you can imagine the advancement physically, and I agreed with everything about what you said, but that life on Earth was miserable. I don't actually agree with that.
I know you don't.
The way that I look at it is that, can you imagine the spiritual advancement side by side with the technological and the intellectual advancement? So, having that spiritual realization and awakening, all that, it seems to me all of these other accomplishments, it wouldn't be worth very much. What is the line in the New Testament is, what does it gain a man to win the world but lose his own soul? It's really good. I mean, really kind of sums it up quite well. We've seen a lot of people who've done that. We've watched them in public as celebrities do that. So I think it is a great temptation in a sense. And so, we're kind of, by engaging with this information around Ahriman, I think we're getting a hint that we're going to need, that's going to be crucial in the back of our mind to say, as the technology rolls out, I'm not going to get sucked into it. I'm going to use it, and I'm going to have the awareness so that when the culture goes into it and goes into the tank for it, I'm going to spread the awareness to other people and saying, listen, you as an individual are important. The technology is secondary to humanity. There's no question about it. The human being is a fantastic, incredible development and accomplishment. And, no World Economic Forum wanting to depopulate by spreading ideas about people and how they're destroying the environment. Look, it's the corporations that destroy the environment. I've put this on the table over and over again. I'm going to say it again. The alternative media should talk a lot about the environment and the damage that's been done to the environment by the corporations. Why is there like a denial thing about the environment on the alternative side? I don't get that. I never have, because they're so concerned. The climate change thing is an op, and I understand that. But nonetheless, those people have destroyed the environment, and guess who has the money to pay for it? Not people with carbon taxes, but the corporations that are bloated. So the natural turnabout, if you want them to shut up about climate change, just say, yeah, great. 10% of everything that you make to fix it up, since you made all the money telling us it was all right and selling us all this bio stuff that wasn't biodegradable. That makes a lot of sense to me. And it worries me. It comes off that the alternative side is genuinely has a blind spot there. And I think we have to have a much more open conversation about the environment. Yes.
Okay, I have to read this. So Shamanist Anamkara answered my question beautifully. Olivia, these beings may not want to go through the afterlife process where they have to face the ramifications of their actions when on Earth, avoiding the unavoidable by holding themselves back. Then these beings run out of energy because they are not being fed by Source. So they start feeding off the divine souls inhabiting human bodies. Is that not perfect? I think that's the greatest explanation.
Really interesting. It's really interesting. There are a couple of weird things since we're speaking about this. One of them is, in my own investigations, what I've wondered about is if they haven't planned already for their own incarnations, and if there isn't a way for them to know that. That would be the only way, that would be the only kind of explanation for why they cling so much to this materialism, aside from the fact of just being totally possessed by it. So you wonder about guys like that, or the Bushes, or whoever. And, I think the idea that they can schedule their own incarnations makes a lot of sense to me. And knowing what I know about these groups, it wouldn't surprise me. The idea that you can escape the ramifications for your actions, there is karma for those actions. And so therefore, we have to look at it like a force coming in and possessing the consciousness of the people involved. That's a better way, I think, to look at it than someone making an individual choice. You know, I think of it more as once they lower themselves to a certain level, they're in the clutches. Think about a blackmailer, for example. So somebody with blackmail, like deep state blackmail, we've done a lot of different shows around this. When they get to that point, they may have started out thinking, you know, and I'm thinking of actually Fitz and her boss there at HUD, Jack Kemp, and he's somebody who genuinely wanted to make a difference and do all this stuff, but they had all this deep state blackmail on him. And so there's a person who makes a certain type of choice and weakens themselves through their kind of indulgence and then becomes part of that system. So you're chained around that wheel. And so we can see our choices become very important. But the idea of the dark astral force of Ahriman harvesting humanity and what they're building it up for, you know, is large cosmological in style. So we have to look at it that way. But we're looking at a large scale movement around the technology on kind of a mind-blowing level. And when you think of it that way, we can take the mind-blowing cosmology of Steiner and lay it against that development and say, oh, these, you know, these things kind of do mesh up quite well. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Whew, we're winding down episode X-126. This is the Steiner warning on the eighth sphere and Ahriman and the war of all against all, which they've been putting in place. And it's funny how much about war that we hear in relation to this. We're going to take a couple more questions. I have one more quote, and then we're going to call it a show.
Okay. Gil and Joy R. Is there a plant we can use to keep us out of the eighth sphere? I would add, is there a specific tool? I mean, I think they're thinking like an herb or something like that.
Oh, a plant?
A plant, yeah.
Well, you're really good on plants and herbs. I know a lot about that.
Well, I mean, this is about self-remembering mostly, right? Isn't it? Just sort of, if you'd say, how do you fall into the eighth sphere? It's falling asleep.
It's consciousness. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I always think it's good to have good type of plants around and things of that nature. But the eighth sphere takes place within you, right? So you get sucked into it or you don't. And it can't overwhelm you and just take you. Like, you have to participate in order for you to get involved with it. So there's a little more about the eighth sphere. Actually, I'm going to read some eighth sphere quotes and then use that as a way to have a bigger answer for this question. What is called the eighth sphere was introduced into earthly evolution in ancient times. This is Steiner again. As one of its aspects, the eighth sphere consists of man's acquiring such a preference for an attachment to his lower nature that Lucifer is not able to remove the higher nature from it. This is a very interesting piece. Every time Lucifer endeavored to spiritualize human beings, they were too strongly habituated to the flesh to follow him. So the Luciferian beings wanted to take us away in our imagination from our bodies. And interestingly enough, it was almost a kind of, a sense of the physical that kept us here. So this is a very interesting crisscross that takes place. Every time Lucifer endeavored to spiritualize human beings, they were too strongly habituated to the flesh to follow him. If they had not been possessed by this cleaving to the flesh of the physical nature, they would have followed Lucifer off into the cosmos there and disappeared, basically. This is one of the great mysteries of cosmic existence, that a divine element was actually implanted in human nature so that it might have, as it were, a greater heaviness than it would have been possessed if this divine and necessary element had not been implanted in it. If it had not been implanted, human souls would have obeyed Lucifer. When we go back into ancient times, we find everywhere that the religions lay emphasis on the necessity of human beings reverencing what is earthly, what is an earthly connection living in flesh and blood, so that they may be heavy enough not to be led out into the universe. Since all things having a relationship to both the human and the cosmic require not only an earthly, but also a cosmic arrangement, what you find described in my book, Outline of Occult Science, which is an excellent book, occurred at a certain time Not only was the Earth formed, revolving in its orbit around the sun, but it was provided with the moon as its satellite. What does it mean that the Earth has a moon as its satellite? It means nothing more than that it required a force through which it can attract and hold the moon nearby. Should the Earth not possess this power to hold the moon, then the spiritual correlation of this force would not be able to chain man to his lower nature, because this force, from the spiritual point of view, is the same as that which the Earth attracts the moon. It may be said then that the moon is placed in the universe as an opponent of Lucifer in order to hinder him. I have already alluded to this mystery and pointed out that in the period of materialism of the 19th century, this truth has been exactly reversed in A.P. Sennett's book, Esoteric Buddhism. There, the moon is described as something actually hostile to man. The truth is that it is not hostile to him, but prevents him from falling victim to the temptation of Lucifer. It acts as the cosmic correlation of what constitutes the attachment of the human being to his lower nature. Rather than tearing the souls out of the lower nature and thereby preventing the concomitant spiritualization, a subconscious process was required. Had the arrangement been conscious, man would have followed the urges of his lower nature in full consciousness and would have sunk to the animal level. There had to be something in the lower nature of which man was not conscious and which he did not follow except as a human being on earth would fall, that flowed into his lower nature as a divine element. Especially the God of the Old Testament, the Yahweh God, was concerned that the human being should remain on earth. Yahweh is connected in the mysterious way with the moon, as you will find explained in occult science. Blavatsky developed special malice in her secret doctrine by maligning Jehovah as a mere moon god. She wanted to replace him with Lucifer, whom she undertook to represent as the friend of the spirit. To be sure, Lucifer is just that, but only in the particular sense I have explained. Blavatsky tried to represent the Yahweh God as the God of the mere lower nature, whereas it really constituted an opposition to Lucifer that was implanted in lower nature. So this is very interesting, and it's good for us to end on this. Basically, the moon aspect and this idea that was trotted out there that the eighth sphere was the moon. The moon is incredibly helpful. It's not this kind of hindrance aspect. So the moon helps our evolution track and keeps us involved with the earth in the proper way. Now, what's fascinating in the Steiner system, what's fascinating is the eighth sphere works in just the opposite fashion. It takes the imagination and it takes the personage, the being, the spiritual identity of the being, and it sucks it into a different realm. So, the creation of an artificial realm, a sphere that is in development to be a world. And the idea is what would happen if this development were allowed to take its course and Ahriman was successful in creating the eighth sphere and having human beings be attached to it, would be that the evolutionary process of humanity would become trapped in what? The eighth sphere to the earth, the eighth sphere to the earth. This whole piece, then, that Steiner's talking about our natural spiritual evolution versus this detour, in my mind, then becomes, there are a series of crucial battles that are involved with it. And so what's happened is, spiritually, we've had the ability to throw off Ahriman. But Ahriman's goal in the 21st century is, through the technology, I can win you back. And that's what we're seeing happen. So this is the great battle, and it's much better if it's a battle that goes on while we're aware, because then we could say, the technology is taking over my life. I'd rather have my life and my spiritual life and balance myself out against all the technological happenings around me. That's what the culture needs to do to balance itself out and become sane. Right now, it's a small group, heavily influenced by Ahriman, creating what? The cosmology of the eighth sphere, and people getting sucked in as a result. And with that, Miss Olivia, I'll take your last question.
Okay. First, I wanted to read this from Gigi.
Yeah.
The ethosphere is linked through resonance, through our thoughts and feelings. Purifying the body can help us sense the quality of our mind. Alertness is key.
Oh, yes.
Gigi is so good at just crystallizing it perfectly.
Alertness is key.
Yeah, and
no question.
And you can't do that without purifying your body. So I have been doing intermittent fasting, and I gave up all bread and all grains.
Fantastic.
And alcohol for the last almost 2 weeks now. The clarity, I feel so much better, the lack of inflammation, but I can see how it's changing my consciousness.
Well, see, this
very
is it.
quickly.
This is it. It's it is literally small choices, right? And they can have a large impact. There's no question about it. Clarity of mind. I mean, when you work with your diet, it really gives you a clear mind. There's no question about it.
We want a health of a civilization is what we're talking about. We want the health of the planet. It has to start with our own health. We like to think, oh, we can eat what we want, and we're all at war, and I deserve this scone, And
well, I'll tell you what's interesting though, and this is something where Casey makes hey, I've got a good picture of Casey here. Casey makes this saying. He has so much influence about diet, and he has so many readings that deal with it. But he also says that, basically your attitude towards what you're eating is crucial. So when I sometimes get around people who are really hooked on certain types of diets, it becomes a kind of a religion to them. And don't eat this, don't eat that. It becomes, I feel like they've entered into almost like a slave zone or an obsessive zone. Nothing about what you're doing. I mean, you're doing things for straight up health. But I've had people, talk to me, and it's so funny because this one person will come up to me and say, vegetarianism is the only thing that you can do and they have a great list of reasons. And then there's people who are all into the meat diet and all this kind of thing. And what do they call the meat diet? Keto, right. And they'll come down and they've got all the same things. And I think to myself, I'm sure somewhere in the middle between these two is absolutely right. If you look into the Casey thing, you've got a balance of alkaline and acid food. There's a little bit of meat. There's a lot of vegetables and all the rest. But it's interesting to me how the mind, this is where the Gurdjieff work comes in handy. We have all the mystery schools tonight. We got Casey, we got Steiner, we got Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff says that there's an aspect of the centers which hijacks the intellectual center. And it's interesting because I feel like when you're talking about diet, it shouldn't have any kind of emotional resonance at all. It should just be kind of like, you do your thing. It's not a religion. And, I feel like people can pay attention for certain types of reasons to observe a good diet, and people should be aware of the holistic research that's been done behind these things. But don't give it to me like it's a religion, even if it's vegetarianism or the other way. That's the funny thing. The same people with the same great intention will give you this advice or that advice, and they're exactly opposite.
And I think there are different intentions behind it. What's your motivation? So I am a sugar addict, as you know, but I also, I'm a caffeine addict, and I reduce that. So what I'm doing is I'm stabilizing my nervous system.
No, that's crucial.
Actually, and I think this is why it's working this time for the first time,
great. That's fantastic.
ever. There's something, because if we're going to talk about consciousness, you have to think about your adrenaline, and calming your nervous system so that you can actually sit still, meditate, be present, have realizations, embody the light, all of that. You can't do that if you're overstimulated.
Yeah, that's really true. Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay. So final question?
Yes.
Okay. So VK, question. Sometimes I feel like we're inside a matrix run by a very sophisticated AI. We are following an interactive script/movie. What does DJ think?
Well, that's pure eighth sphere thinking that you're mentioning there. And the script is lack of awareness, right? You need to, just like when the Johnny Depp thing is that's pure harmonic programming. I mean, you sit there, you have nothing, literally nothing to do with Johnny Depp's life It's personal life, Amber Heard, none of them. It means nothing to you. It will benefit you nothing by learning anything about it. Somebody who's a real fan of Johnny Depp might want to learn about his personal life, So yeah, I get it, but there's nothing there. And what's fascinating though is how easily it is for them to turn on that switch, and everybody's talking about it, even smart people. So that's bothersome, because the level of control that is gained through the social media networks, through the technology, is an arresting mechanism. When people used to listen to the radio, they'd be using a particular function. And so the audio would put them into a certain place. When you get to the TV and movies, you're getting audio and picture. You're already pretty well programmed. Well, now your iPhone and your smartphones are vibrating with you. And, they're feeding out entrainment to you through it. So if I'm in Twitter, I might not even find that interesting, but there's something in Twitter that is saying, that is part of a subliminal technology that says get into this. And so that's how it works. And that is highly harmonic. And the idea is pay attention, stay distracted. Because if you're aware of who you are and your higher spiritual centers, your purpose in life, you're not going to be a pawn for big advertising, social media control, insane political movements, So Depp lives matter, right?
I'm going to add one more thing. Okay, so there's different levels of self-awareness.
Yes.
And so you can be self-conscious in a way that but you're still in your ego. You're observing yourself, whether you're addicted to this, your behaviors and stuff, but you're still thinking of yourself as your name. That is a completely different thing from when you meditate and you separate from your ego and you identify with the observer, the one who is behind watching all of it, who has complete equanimity and is not attached to the outcomes and does not get emotional about any of it. And so that is the place ultimately that we need to cultivate.
When you get into that Buddhist side of thing, you know it very quite well. And I actually have to say, I think what you said about diet's important too. I think I've got two things for us to end with here. One of them was there was a real possibility that during this episode, I'm going to save this for a different time, that the whole episode was going to be about poison. Because there's a series of lectures that Steiner does where he correlates Ahriman with poison, literally different types of poisons. I found that very interesting. So I'm just going to give you a taste of that so you know that in the future when we do that one, what's coming. Quote, ordinary poisons, which are Ahrimanic substances left over from ancient moon, are the opponents of progressive evolution. Distilled in a way diluted, they actually provide the physical substance, which is the bearer of our spiritual life. Basically, homeopathy. Mm-hmm. Homeopathy can take a poison, which can trigger a response in your body and just give you the homeopathic version of it, and your body does the same response without the poison effect. What happens when a disease form comes into being, when a form falls ill? Medical science will have to concern itself more and more with such things. And he goes through this whole thing about how certain diseases are Ahrimanic and certain conditions are Luciferian. And then he says, if you can find the proper polar opposite from the Luciferic growth will be balanced by the poison, which is Ahrimanic, these two can balance each other out if they work in the right way. From this, you see that the concepts of what is Luciferic and what is Ahrimanic may be pursued right down to the realms of natural life. They may also be pursued upwards into human life, human social life. If we wanted to be cleverer than the gods, we might ask, why did they not make the world without all these poisons? So that's fascinating to me because it's saying, you know what? These two things, Lucifer and Ahriman, are the biggest opponents to humanity. But if you can balance them off against each other, you can actually stand in the middle and benefit from that battle. So we see that that's a daily thing that we engage in every day, whether it's dealing with an unjust situation, the bad political scene, poor leadership, individual disappointments, whatever it happens to be, you can always stand in the middle between those two forces. My final quote on Ahriman, to give us that idea again of the transhumanism, and remember the mineral, the technology mineral. Now these Ahrimanic beings strive to get into man. Man was created of the dust of the earth. The mineral element is the true sphere of Ahriman. He can enter that sphere and feel comfortable there. He feels very comfortable wherever he can permeate us through that which is mineral in us. You secrete salts in your body, and thereby you are able to think through the deposit of salt through all mineral processes valid and operative in you. You become thinking beings. Ahriman seeks to enter that sphere. You thinking beings, but in reality, he has only a part in the mineral. Therefore, he is fighting to get a share also in man's blood, in his breathing, in his assimilation. He can only do this if he can inject certain characteristics into the soul of man. If, for instance, he can inject into the human soul a tendency to a dry, barren understanding which seeks an outlet in materialism and mocks all truths. We see a lot of that. And mocks all truths permeated by feeling. If he can permeate man with intellectual pride, that he can approach man's blood, his breath, his assimilation, then he can, as it were, creep out of the salts and minerals in man and creep into his blood breathing and digestion. This is the conflict being fought from the side of Ahriman through the very being of man. This gives us some impression that we are engaged in something that is trying to enter into humanity, and the best way to throw it off is to be aware of it. And we've discussed it from a technological level, a cosmological level, a spiritual level, even medical level tonight. And there's so much whenever we get into the eighth sphere for us to tackle with it, that I know even going as deep as we did tonight, it's a very deep subject, so we'll do more on it. And thank you so much for your questions tonight. Off the charts, and Miss Olivia.
Incredible. All right. I have a bunch of super chatters to thank.
All right.
Okay. Eurythmy is Fun, Harvardian, Stephen, Jim Sarge 3ID, Roosevelt Media News, Erica Swenson Elliott, Joe Sampson, Gillenjoy R, Doreen Hewitt, Plato Always Knew, Carol Linda Gonzalez, Tall White Nordic Aliens from the Pleiades, Stefan Vanderlaan.
I knew they were out there.
Karen Carpenter, Occult Fan, Luke Walker, Brian Storm, Empress Anaya, Brian Berner, PRBR, Hungry for Mars, Zach Boyles, Thomas Tyson, and Max Jeterman. Thank you so much.
Unbelievable. Thank you for your support of the program and for the show that we do, and for all your contributions tonight, and also to our great subscribers who keep us going. We really appreciate all your support, without which we couldn't do this show.
Do you want to give out the address for checks if people don't want to use PayPal?
Yeah, once in a while, people let me know that they don't like to do anything electronically. If you are someone who wants to send a check, you can send it to Dark Journalist, 1770 Massachusetts Avenue, number 238, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Lovely place to be. 02140. And we very much appreciate that. We'll be back next week, and we have some great surprises for you coming up in May. Like I said, go and sign up for the newsletter as well at darkjournalist.com. And I'll do a couple of shout outs here. Let's see. All right, I can show people. I forgot. Thomasine Richards, thank you. Boston needs to beat Carolina. Heck, yes. I feel an harmonic wave sweeping through me. Gypsy Moon, Olivia Wings Girl, there you are. Sam Dill, Brian Storm, Kat Goida, thank you for being out there tonight. Gigi, of course, really great to see you. Fantastic. We're doing an interview with Gigi. It's coming up very shortly. Esoteric Fairy Tales, great name. That's a good one. Roosevelt, thank you, sir. Another great show. Thanks, DJ and Olivia Wings Girl. There she is. Golden Girl, go Boston. I like that. James Clemens, you got it. Najat, it's great. Thanks for your questions. Great questions tonight. Alien Scientist. He's one of those guys that I was talking about, just calling out a lot of the UFO chicanery going on. And he's doing a good job. Golden Girl, Don Nue, absolutely. Shella Gavin. Wow, great questions tonight. Really. Maybe Steiner is feeding into it all. Interesting. Well, I'm sure he's awakening into it all. That's for sure. Brenda Fisher, thanks for another awesome show. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Outstanding crowd tonight, just off the charts. So much gratitude to you. Well, I appreciate that. I get so much from the ideas room, and don't you really find that it stimulates ideas for the shows? It's great. It gives us that feedback, and so it's just sensational. So much appreciated. What else we got? Esoteric Fairy Tales. That's a great name. I'm going to say it again. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Bobby Orr lives on. Oh my God, Bobby Orr. What about Larry Bird? Don't make me go deep. What about Fred Lynn and Jim Rice? All you need is Colonial. Gigi's out there. She's doing great. It's great. Gigi just did a show. I haven't watched it. Last night she did a show, and it's the Denouement on her Mars series, and I'm looking forward to it. So that's something I want everyone to go and check out.
I don't know. Is it supposed to be the last episode?
Well, I think it's the cherry on top.
Okay,
of the whole thing.
Because I think it never really ends. Right?
Right. Well, no, her series doesn't, but just the Mars part.
Mars, nah.
Right.
There's always more.
Peter Dale Scott, a cult fan, calls him out. That is, everyone has to get some of that. Peter Dale Scott, American Deep State. That's the one. Or the assassination, Deep Politics and the Assassination of JFK. It's unbelievable. I'm amazed it even got into print, frankly. And he's 92. He's still doing amazing work. El Qaeda, thank you very much, sir. And yes, I agree with you 100%. Kat, happy Mother's Day. Right. All the moms out there. Sunday is Mother's Day.
I have a limerick to read.
Yes.
From
Thomas Tyson.
Our own Thomas Tyson.
Yes.
There once was a fellow named Steiner who could make a fine point even finer. He was anthroposophic, but not hyperbolic. I'd buy him breakfast at a diner.
Oh. I like the way that last line just took it down to Chinatown. Oh, that's great. Fantastic. Josh, it's great to see you out there. Griefa Jones, Jimmy Paul, Brian Storm, Boom Crypto. I just started the show. Hey, you've got some great stuff coming up, my friend. Nathan Allen, thank you very much. How generous of you. You're a very generous supporter of the show, and we very much appreciate it. Excellent. Roosevelt, good to see you, sir. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Golden Girl, everybody. Jay Cameron, the Organic Veil Radio. We will see you all next week, and some exciting things coming up, as I said, for May. There might be some little, speaking of intermittent fasting, intermittent broadcasts, because so many things are changing so fast. But it's great to have everyone out there. We will see you all next week.
Okay. God bless everybody.
Fantastic. Nicely done, Miss Olivia.
Thank you.
Great commentary. And my notes, the notes I didn't get to, psychic imprisonment. We'll have to do that next time. Thanks, everyone. And it says end broadcast, but
Never really ends.
never really ends. See you next week.